Good evening and welcome to Embers and Pages, where we retell the world's most beautiful stories in a voice meant for rest. How are you tonight? I hope your day treated you kindly. If it didn't, if the hours felt rushed or the world demanded too much, you're here now. And here time slows. Here we wander not with haste but with wonder. We let the world grow vast and gentle around us. Tonight we're setting out on an extraordinary voyage. Jules Verne's 1873 masterpiece, Around the World in 80 Days. This is a story of railways and steamships, of exotic landscapes and impossible deadlines. But more than that, it's a story about what happens when precision meets the unpredictable, when a man of rigid routines discovers that the world is wider, stranger, and more beautiful than any timetable could contain. Through the eyes of Phileas Fogg and his devoted companion Passepartout, we'll cross continents, brave oceans, rescue the imperiled, and find that the greatest treasures are never the ones we set out to claim. Before we depart, let's prepare ourselves. Dim the lights or turn them off entirely. Lower the volume to just above a whisper. Let your ears reach for the words, quieting the rest of your mind. Settle into your most comfortable position. Let your body relax completely into the mattress, into the pillows. Pull your blanket close. Close your eyes if it feels right. Breathe slowly, in and out. There's nowhere you need to be but here. Don't worry if you drift away before our journey ends. That's exactly what should happen. This story will be waiting if you wish to return tomorrow. But tonight, sleep is the only destination that matters. Our story begins in London, in the year 1872, in the precise and orderly world of a gentleman named Phileas Fogg, a man of such exactitude that his life runs like clockwork, not yet knowing that in mere hours, he will wager his entire fortune on a race against time itself, a journey that will carry him to the far corners of the earth. In the heart of London, at number 7, Savile Row, lived Phileas Fogg, Esquire, a man about whom almost nothing was known, and yet whose life was conducted with such exactitude that one could set one's watch by his movements. He was not a man of society, not gregarious, not given to confidences or displays of emotion. He belonged to the Reform Club, yes, and he played whist with unwavering skill, but beyond these facts, London society knew precious little about him. Some said he had been a traveller in his youth, that he had seen distant lands, though he never spoke of them. Others whispered that he had made his fortune in ventures unknown, perhaps in India, perhaps in trade. But Phileas Fogg offered no explanations, no stories, no glimpses into his past. He simply existed, punctual and precise, moving through his days with the regularity of the seasons. His servant, a Frenchman named Jean Passepartout, had only just entered his service that very morning, the 2nd of October, 1872. Passepartout, the name meant goes everywhere, had wandered through many employments, always restless, always seeking. He had been a traveling circus performer, a gymnastics instructor, a fireman in Paris, even a valet to several difficult masters. Now, weary of uncertainty and adventure, he longed for nothing more than calm, predictable days. When he heard of this English gentleman who lived like a mathematical equation, who demanded precision above all else, Passepartout thought he had found his haven at last. He arrived at the house in Savile Row to find it silent, orderly, every object in its appointed place. The rooms were neither warm nor cold, neither lavish nor sparse. They simply were functional and exact. Mr. Fogg's instructions were delivered in a voice devoid of emotion. The morning shaving water must be exactly 86 degrees Fahrenheit. Breakfast at precisely 8:23. Tea and toast, no variations. Departure for the Reform Club at 11:30, not a moment sooner or later. Return at midnight. Every action scheduled, every hour accounted for. Passepartout marveled at this precision. Here at last was a master whose life moved like clockwork, a life where nothing unexpected could intrude. He unpacked his few belongings, arranged Mr. Fogg's modest wardrobe, and settled into what he believed would be years of peaceful, uneventful service. That evening, Phileas Fogg sat in the Reform Club's reading room, surrounded by his usual companions, gentlemen of leisure, wealth, and strong opinions. The room smelled of leather and tobacco, of old wood and older money. Gas lamps cast a golden glow over newspapers and card tables. Fogg sat apart from the card players for now, reading the Daily Telegraph with the same measured attention he gave to everything. The conversation turned, as it often did, to the news of the day, and today's news concerned a daring bank robbery. £55,000 had been stolen from the Bank of England by a man whose description was frustratingly vague. Average height, average build, a gentleman's bearing, well-dressed but unremarkable. His identity was unknown, his whereabouts a mystery, but his escape was presumed to involve swift flight abroad, perhaps to the continent, perhaps further. One gentleman, a railway director, remarked confidently that the thief would never be caught, not with the vastness of the world to hide in. He could be in Paris by now, or Brussels, or Hamburg. How is one to find a single man in all of Europe? Another countered that modern technology, the telegraph, the expanding railways, the great steamship lines, had made the world smaller, more navigable, more transparent. Scotland Yard has already telegraphed every port. They've sent descriptions to Paris, to Suez, to Bombay, to New York. A criminal can run, but he cannot hide. Not anymore. The world has become too connected. A third gentleman laughed. Connected, perhaps, but still vast. There are 1,000 routes, 1,000 places to vanish. I wager the fellow is already sipping wine in some remote corner of the earth, laughing at us all. It was then that someone mentioned an article published that very morning in the Daily Telegraph, a piece that calculated, with schedules and timetables, that it was now theoretically possible to travel around the entire circumference of the world in 80 days. The notion had been debated among railway enthusiasts and steamship companies, a mathematical curiosity more than a practical proposition. The gentlemen at the Reform Club scoffed. Theoretically, perhaps, the article admitted, but only under perfect conditions. One would have to catch every connection precisely. One would need cooperative weather, no mechanical failures, no political disturbances, no human error. Any delay, a missed train in India, a storm in the Pacific, a broken rail in America, and the entire delicate scheme would collapse like a house of cards. Impossible in practice, someone declared. Too many variables. Too much left to chance and circumstance. Phileas Fogg, who had been listening in his characteristic silence, folded his newspaper with quiet precision and set it aside. "It is possible," he said, his voice even certain and unnervingly calm. The others turned to him, some amused, some curious. Fogg rarely spoke in company, and when he did, his words carried a strange weight. "Come now, Fogg," one gentleman said, smiling. "In theory, yes, if every star aligns, if Providence favors the traveler. But in practice, you're a man of precision. You know how the world works. Delays are inevitable." Fogg's gaze, steady and unblinking, did not waver. "I would wager that it could be done, not in theory, in practice. I would wager that I could do it." A deeper hush fell over the table now. Someone laughed nervously, thinking it a dry jest. But Phileas Fogg did not smile. He never smiled. His face remained as impassive as stone. "You're serious," another gentleman said slowly, disbelief coloring his voice. "Entirely," Fogg replied. He reached into his coat with deliberate calm and produced his bankbook. "I will wager £20,000 that I can travel around the world in 80 days or less, counting from this evening. I will depart tonight and return to this very room, to this very chair, on Saturday, the 21st of December, at 8:45 in the evening. Not 1 minute later." The room erupted in murmurs, exclamations, a few nervous laughs. £20,000, a staggering sum, a fortune. And Fogg spoke of it as if wagering on the turn of a card. But the gentlemen of the Reform Club were not men to back down from a wager, and within moments, 5 of them had put up £4,000 each to match Fogg's 20,000. Hands were shaken across the table. The bet was recorded in the club's ledger, witnessed and sealed. £40,000 now hung on the outcome of this audacious journey. Phileas Fogg rose from his chair, as calm as if he had merely wagered on a hand of whist. He consulted his pocket watch, a beautiful instrument, gold and precise, its ticking steady as a heartbeat, and noted the time, 8:45 precisely. He had 80 days, not 1 day more. He returned to Savile Row and found Passepartout preparing for bed, already dreaming of the peaceful routines to come. "Passepartout," Fogg said, his voice mild, as though announcing the weather. "We are leaving for Dover and Calais within the hour. Pack a carpet bag, 2 shirts, 3 pairs of socks, 3 pairs of stockings, your toiletries, a light coat, we shall not need more. Passepartout stared at him, thunderstruck. Leaving, monsieur, tonight, but I've only just unpacked. Where are we going? Around the world, Fogg said simply. We depart in precisely 10 minutes. Do not forget the carpet bag. And bring my mackintosh and travelling cloak. Passepartout's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Around the world. He had just settled into this quiet house, this orderly life, and now, this. Monsieur, he managed weakly, did you say around the world? I did, 9 minutes now. And so, at precisely 8:45 on the evening of October 2nd, 1872, Phileas Fogg and Jean Passepartout stepped out into the London night, bound for Dover, for Calais, for Paris, for lands beyond imagining. Fogg carried his small carpet bag and a leather satchel containing £20,000 in crisp Bank of England notes. Passepartout carried confusion, excitement, a hastily packed bag, and a growing suspicion that his dreams of tranquility had just been shattered beyond repair. As their cab clattered through the gaslit streets toward Charing Cross Station, Passepartout tried to comprehend the enormity of what was happening. Around the world, 80 days. His master, this quiet, unreadable Englishman, had wagered his entire fortune on a race against time itself. Neither man knew that at that very moment, across the city at Scotland Yard, a detective named Fix was studying a telegram with intense interest. A more detailed description of the bank robber had just arrived. A gentleman, well-mannered, reserved, about 40 years of age, tall, well-dressed, precise in his habits. The description matched, in almost every particular, a certain Phileas Fogg of Savile Row, who was, according to another telegram from the Reform Club's porter, departing England that very night on some mad journey around the world. Detective Fix's sharp eyes narrowed. A man fleeing the country just days after a bank robbery, a man carrying a fortune in cash, a man hiding behind the pretense of an eccentric wager. It was too convenient, too suspicious, too perfect a cover for a criminal on the run. Fix made his decision in an instant. He would follow this Phileas Fogg, shadow him across continents if necessary, keep him in sight until the arrest warrant could be secured and delivered. The law had a long reach now, longer than any thief could run. Justice, Fix believed with the fervor of the righteous, would be served. And so 3 men embarked on journeys that night, though only one of them knew his true destination. Fogg travelled with iron certainty and printed schedules, a man who had calculated every mile, every connection, every steamship departure. Passepartout travelled with bewildered loyalty, a servant swept into a current far stronger than himself. Fix travelled with grim determination and moral conviction, certain that he pursued a criminal, certain that righteousness was on his side. The world, vast and turning, awaited them all. The night train to Dover cut through the dark English countryside, its engine huffing steam into the cold October air. Inside, Phileas Fogg sat in silence, his face as impassive as ever, a man who betrayed no anxiety, no excitement, no flicker of doubt. He checked his pocket watch against the railway schedule, noted with satisfaction that they were precisely on time, and gazed briefly out the window at the darkened fields rushing past. Passepartout sat across from him, unable to rest, stealing glances at his enigmatic master, wondering what manner of man could wager a fortune on a whim, could append his carefully ordered life without a single visible hesitation. Was Fogg mad? Was he brilliant? Was he running from something or running toward it? But Phileas Fogg, if he felt anything at all, did not show it. His hands rested calmly on his knees. His breathing was even. He seemed no more troubled than if he were sitting in his usual chair at the Reform Club, reading the newspaper before dinner. The world, enormous and unpredictable, awaited him. 80 days, 19,200 minutes. Not 1 minute more. The journey, impossible and irrevocable, had begun. The journey from London to Paris passed in a blur of rail carriages and channel crossings. Phileas Fogg sat in the same composed silence he had maintained since departure, consulting his watch with mechanical regularity, checking his itinerary, noting each station, each delay, each minute gained or lost. Passepartout, by contrast, could barely sit still. His mind spun with questions, with disbelief, with a strange exhilaration he hadn't felt in years. They crossed the channel by steamer, the dark water churning beneath them, the lights of Dover fading behind, and the shores of France drawing near. Passepartout stood at the railing, breathing the salt air, feeling the immensity of what they had begun. Around the world, the phrase seemed impossible, a dream spoken aloud. In Paris, they had only a few hours. The train to Turin would depart at 8:45 in the evening, and Fogg intended to be on it. They did not tour the city. They did not dine at fine restaurants or visit old haunts. Passepartout had lived in Paris for years, had walked its boulevards and laughed in its cafes, but there was no time for nostalgia now. Fogg waited at the station, patient and unmoved, while Passepartout dashed out to purchase a few necessities: shirts, toiletries, a wool traveling blanket. When Passepartout returned, breathless, Fogg merely glanced at his watch and said, 3 minutes to spare. Well done. They boarded the train for Turin, and then the journey truly began to stretch across landscapes. Through the night they traveled, the train cutting through the dark heart of France, past vineyards and villages, past rivers gleaming in starlight. Fogg slept lightly, his head resting against the seat back, his breathing even. Passepartout tried to sleep but found himself staring out the window instead, watching the world unfold. By morning they were in the Alps. The mountains rose around them, white peaks against blue sky, their grandeur almost painful to behold. The train climbed through narrow passes, clinging to the edges of cliffs, crossing gorges on bridges that seemed impossibly delicate. Passepartout pressed his face to the glass, awestruck. He had traveled before, yes, but never like this, never with such speed, such relentless forward motion. Fogg, when he woke, merely consulted his schedule and remarked, "We are on time." They arrived in Turin, changed trains, continued south toward the coast. By evening they were in Brindisi, a port town on the heel of Italy's boot, where the steamship Mongolia awaited to carry them across the Mediterranean to Suez. The Mongolia was a sleek vessel, built for speed, her paddle wheels powerful, her engines the pride of the Peninsular and Oriental Steam Navigation Company. She would take them through the Mediterranean, past Greece and Crete, past the ancient coasts, to Egypt and the narrow passage that had only recently been carved through the desert. The Suez Canal, wonder of the modern age, joining the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, shortening the voyage to India by thousands of miles. Passepartout stood on deck as the Mongolia steamed out of Brindisi harbor, watching Italy recede into the dusk. The sea spread vast and darkening around them. He thought of the wager, of the impossibility of it, and wondered if his master was brilliant or simply mad. Perhaps both. Fogg, meanwhile, had settled into the ship's saloon, where he played whist with a few fellow passengers, an Englishman traveling to Bombay, a Dutch merchant, a retired colonel. Fogg played with his usual quiet precision, winning more often than not, his face betraying nothing. It was during this journey that Detective Fix first made his appearance. Fix had boarded the Mongolia in Brindisi, traveling under the pretense of routine police business. He was a small, wiry man with sharp features and sharper eyes, a man who noticed everything, forgot nothing, and pursued his quarry with the single-mindedness of a hunting dog. He had received the description of the bank robber, had made his deductions, and had taken the fastest route to intercept Fogg's journey. Now he watched from a distance, studying this calm, enigmatic Englishman, looking for signs of guilt, of nervousness, of a criminal fleeing justice. But Phileas Fogg showed nothing. He ate his meals at the same hour each day. He took his constitutional walk around the deck at precisely the same time each morning and evening. He played whist with the same methodical skill. He spoke little, revealed less. Fix found this infuriating. A guilty man should betray himself somehow, a nervous glance, a slip of the tongue, an excess of caution. But Fogg was impenetrable, a clockwork man, and Fix could not decide if this was the mark of innocence or of extraordinary discipline. The Mongolia steamed eastward, past the coasts of Greece, past Crete's mountains rising from the sea. The weather was fine, the sea calm, the sky an endless sweep of blue. Passepartout explored the ship, made friends with the crew, practiced his English, and marveled at the speed with which they devoured the miles. So this was modern travel. So this was the world knit together by steam and iron. Fogg, for his part, seemed utterly unmoved by the beauty of the Mediterranean, the history that lay in every island and coastline. He remained in the saloon or his cabin, emerging only for meals and his walks, a man for whom scenery held no interest, only schedules. On the 5th day out from Brindisi, they sighted the coast of Egypt. The sun blazed down from a sky like brass, and the land shimmered in the heat, ochre and ancient. By evening they had reached Port Said, the northern entrance to the Suez Canal. Passepartout stood at the railing, watching the port come into view, a sprawl of buildings, docks crowded with ships, the smell of spices and smoke and salt. Beyond lay the desert, vast and unknowable, and cutting through it, the canal, one of the great engineering feats of the age. The Mongolia entered the canal at dawn. It was a strange, surreal passage. The ship slid through a ribbon of water carven through sand, the desert pressing close on either side, the heat almost unbearable. There were no waves here, no wind, only the steady churn of the paddle wheels and the shoreline gliding past, utterly flat, utterly barren. Fogg watched from the deck briefly, then returned to his cabin, uninterested. Passepartout, however, could not look away. This was a marvel, this was human will reshaping the earth itself, and here they were, passing through it as casually as one might cross a street. They passed small stations along the canal, places where laborers worked in the blazing sun, where camels stood watching the ships with indifferent eyes. They passed Lake Timseh, a shimmering expanse of water in the midst of the sand. And by evening they emerged into the Red Sea at Suez, the passage complete. Fogg consulted his notebook. They had gained half a day. The schedule was holding. All was well. Detective Fix, meanwhile, had gone ashore at Suez. He sent a telegram to London, requesting the arrest warrant be dispatched immediately. He also made inquiries, discreet and careful, about Fogg's movements, his companions, his behavior. Everything pointed to a man on a journey, nothing more. But Fix's instincts screamed otherwise. He also encountered, quite by chance, a young man who introduced himself as Passepartout, valet to Mr. Phileas Fogg. The Frenchman was friendly, open, utterly without guile. Fix saw an opportunity. He struck up a conversation, offered to show Passepartout the sights of Suez, modest though they were, and casually asked questions. Where was Mr. Fogg going? Why this mad journey? Was he always so calm, so precise? Passepartout, delighted to have company, answered freely. His master, he said, was the most punctual man alive. The wager was genuine, a matter of honor. They would circle the globe and return to London in 80 days, not 1 minute more. As for why Fogg had made the bet, Passepartout could only shrug. He is English, monsieur. The English do these things. Fix smiled and nodded and filed every word away. A wager, a fortune, a man fleeing across the world. Oh, he was guilty. Fix was certain of it. The Mongolia departed Suez that evening, steaming south into the Red Sea. The heat intensified. The sun turned the water to molten bronze. During the day, passengers retreated below decks, seeking shade, while at night they emerged to walk under stars that seemed impossibly bright, impossibly near. Fogg maintained his routine as if they were still in London. Passepartout tried to do the same, but found himself drawn again and again to the deck, to the endless sea, to the strangeness of this journey. They were moving so fast, covering so much ground, and yet the world seemed infinite, inexhaustible. Fix watched them both. He had not yet received the warrant, but it would come. It had to, and when it did, he would act. Until then, he would wait, and watch, and follow Fogg to the ends of the earth if necessary. The Red Sea gave way to the Gulf of Aden, and then they were approaching the port of Aden itself, a barren rock of a place clinging to the edge of the Arabian Peninsula. Here the Mongolia would take on coal, a filthy, exhausting process that would take several hours. Fogg went ashore briefly, not to see the sights, but simply to stretch his legs and add another stamp to his passport. Passepartout accompanied him, and Fix followed at a discreet distance. They walked through the dusty streets, past markets selling carpets and incense, past beggars and merchants, past camels laden with goods. The heat was crushing. Passepartout wiped his brow and marveled that people lived here, in this furnace of stone and sand. Fogg, as always, seemed unaffected. He walked at his usual measured pace, consulted his watch, and returned to the ship precisely when he had planned. The Mongolia departed Aden on schedule, steaming into the Indian Ocean now, the vast stretch of water that lay between them and the subcontinent. The journey across took days, the horizon empty in all directions, the sky and sea merging into one endless blue. And then finally land appeared again, the coast of India, green and hazy in the morning light. Passepartout felt his heart quicken. India, the jewel of the British Empire, the land of elephants and tigers and ancient temples. He had dreamed of seeing it since he was a child. The Mongolia steamed into Bombay Harbour on the 20th of October, exactly on schedule. Fogg consulted his itinerary and allowed himself the faintest nod of satisfaction. They had lost no time. The trains across India would take them to Calcutta, and from there, a steamer to Hong Kong. Everything, so far, was proceeding exactly as planned. Detective Fix, standing on the dock as the passengers disembarked, clenched his jaw in frustration. The warrant had not yet arrived. He could not make the arrest. Not yet, but he would not give up. He would follow Fogg across India, across Asia if necessary. Justice, he told himself, was patient. And so the three men stepped onto Indian soil, each with his own purpose, each unaware of the trials that awaited them in the vast, bewildering, beautiful country that lay ahead. India burst upon them like a fever dream, overwhelming in its color, its noise, its sheer profusion of life. Bombay Harbour teemed with vessels from every corner of the globe, merchant ships, steamers, fishing boats, dhows with lateen sails. The docks swarmed with porters and sailors, with vendors selling fruit and water, with beggars and holy men, with women in brilliant saris and men in white linen, and children darting between the crowds like bright fish. The heat was tremendous, a living weight pressing down from a sky white with sun. The air smelled of spices and coal smoke, of flowers and sweat, of the sea and something else, something ancient and indefinable. Passepartout stepped onto the dock and felt the world tilt slightly beneath him. This was India. This was the fabled East. Fogg, predictably, seemed unaffected. He checked his watch, confirmed that the Great Indian Peninsula Railway would depart for Calcutta at precisely 8 o'clock that evening, and led the way to a hotel where they could rest for a few hours. Passepartout followed, dazed, his eyes trying to take in everything at once. They dined on rice and curried meat, food so spiced that Passepartout's eyes watered, though Fogg ate with his usual methodical detachment. And then, as evening fell, they made their way to the railway station. The train that would carry them across India was a marvel in its own right. A great iron serpent huffing steam, its carriages painted in red and gold, its engine gleaming. Passengers crowded the platform. British officials travelling to posts up country, merchants, soldiers, Indian families with trunks and baskets, Sikhs with magnificent turbans, Muslim traders, Hindu pilgrims. The diversity was staggering. Fogg and Passepartout settled into a first-class carriage, and at precisely 8 o'clock, the train lurched forward, steaming out of Bombay into the gathering darkness. The journey across India would take them northeast, across the vast width of the subcontinent, through jungles and plains, across rivers and mountains, all the way to Calcutta on the far coast. It was a journey of more than 1,000 miles, and the railway company had promised to complete it in 3 days. By morning, they were deep in the interior. Passepartout woke to a landscape utterly foreign, fields of rice stretching to the horizon, villages of mud and thatch, palm trees swaying in the hot wind. Water buffalo wallowed in irrigation ditches. Women in bright cloth worked in the fields, their movements graceful and timeless. Temples rose from the greenery, their towers carved with gods and demons. Fogg sat reading a London newspaper, already a week old, utterly absorbed. Passepartout wanted to shake him, to shout, look at this world, but he knew it would be useless. Fogg was not a man moved by wonder. The train clattered onward, stopping at stations where vendors pressed up to the windows selling mangoes, bananas, papayas, sweets wrapped in leaves, cups of chai so sweet and milky Passepartout could barely drink it. Children ran alongside the train, waving and calling. Holy men sat by the tracks, lost in meditation, oblivious to the roar of the locomotive. They crossed the Western Ghats, the mountains that separated the coastal plain from the Deccan Plateau. The train climbed through lush jungle, through mist, and the calls of unseen birds, past waterfalls tumbling down green cliffs. Monkeys watched from the trees. Once, Passepartout thought he saw a tiger, a flash of orange and black in the undergrowth, but it was gone before he could be sure. Fogg glanced up once, noted that they were on schedule, and returned to his newspaper. On the second day, the landscape changed. The jungle gave way to drier country, to plains of tawny grass, to forests of teak and sal. The heat grew fiercer. Dust swirled through the carriage windows despite the shutters. The train stopped more frequently now, taking on water, letting passengers on and off. At one station, Fogg and Passepartout stepped onto the platform to stretch their legs. The station was a modest building of whitewashed stone, surrounded by dusty trees. A few Indian families sat in the shade, waiting patiently. A vendor sold betel leaves and cigarettes. It was here that they received shocking news. A railway official, a British engineer with a sunburned face, informed them that the railway line terminated 50 miles ahead. The track beyond had not yet been completed. Passengers would have to find their own means of transport to cover the gap until the line resumed on the far side. Fogg's expression did not change, but his voice, when he spoke, was colder than Passepartout had ever heard it. The schedule states that the railway runs all the way to Allahabad. It is listed as operational. The engineer shrugged apologetically. The papers haven't caught up, sir. The track's being laid, but it won't be finished for months. You'll have to find a carriage or horses. Most passengers manage. Fogg consulted his timetable, his jaw tight. This was a delay, an unforeseen complication, and in a journey of 80 days, every hour mattered. They reached the end of the line the following morning. The tracks simply stopped, the rails ending in raw earth and piles of timber, the construction site abandoned in the brutal midday sun. Passengers disembarked in a flurry of confusion and complaint, scattering to hire whatever transport they could find. Fogg and Passepartout stood by the side of the tracks, surveying the desolate landscape. There was no town here, only a few huts, a well, and a scattering of trees offering meager shade. In the distance, the land shimmered with heat, and beyond that, 50 miles away, the railway resumed. 50 miles that would have to be covered by some other means. Purchasing horses or a carriage seemed impossible. Other passengers had already claimed everything available. Fogg, however, was not a man easily defeated. He began making inquiries, offering money, negotiating in his calm, precise English while Passepartout translated when necessary. And then, miraculously, they found something. A man from a nearby village, a Parsi trader, offered them an elephant. Not for hire, mind you, but for sale. The price was exorbitant, £2,000, but the elephant was young and strong and could cover rough terrain far better than any horse. Fogg did not hesitate. He purchased the elephant on the spot. The creature was magnificent, a great grey beast with intelligent eyes and ivory tusks, guided by a mahout, an Indian handler who spoke no English but understood animals with a skill that seemed almost magical. The mahout's name was lost in translation, but he agreed to guide them across the 50 miles for a generous fee. Passepartout stared at the elephant in disbelief. They had bought an elephant. His master, this unreadable Englishman, had bought an elephant as casually as one might purchase a railway ticket. A sort of howdah, a covered seat, was rigged on the elephant's back, and Fogg and Passepartout climbed aboard. The mahout sat on the creature's neck, guiding it with gentle taps and murmured words. And so they set off into the wild interior of India, leaving the railway behind. The journey on elephant back was unlike anything Passepartout had experienced. The elephant moved with a stately, swaying gait, surprisingly smooth despite its size. They traveled through jungle, thick and green, the canopy overhead filtering the sunlight into dappled gold. Parrots shrieked from the branches. The air smelled of earth and leaves and distant rain. They crossed streams where the elephant waded belly deep, its trunk curling up to spray water over its back. They passed through villages where children ran out to watch them pass, laughing and calling. They skirted the edges of teak forests where the trees rose like cathedral pillars. At night, they stopped to rest. The mahout built a small fire, and they ate rice and dal prepared in an iron pot. Fogg sat with his back against a tree, consulting his maps and schedules by firelight, calculating the hours lost, the hours that might still be recovered. Passepartout lay on his back, staring up through the leaves at the stars, listening to the jungle's night sounds, the hum of insects, the distant call of some predator, the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth. It was on the second day of their elephant journey, as they passed through a particularly dense stretch of jungle, that they heard the sound of drums. Low and rhythmic, echoing through the trees. The mahout stiffened, listening. Fogg leaned forward slightly, alert. They emerged from the jungle into a clearing and saw a procession ahead, winding along a narrow path. There were priests in saffron robes, men beating drums, carriers bearing an elaborate canopied platform. And on the platform, a young woman dressed in white, her face serene and resigned. The Mahout spoke urgently to Passepartout, gesturing. Passepartout, his limited Hindi barely sufficient, managed to understand the gist. This was a funeral procession. The woman's husband had died, and she was being taken to his funeral pyre. She would be burned alive alongside his body, a practice called sati, widow burning, a tradition the British Raj had officially banned, but which still persisted in remote regions. Passepartout went pale. "Monsieur," he said to Fogg, his voice shaking, "they're going to burn her alive." Fogg's gaze sharpened. He watched the procession for a long moment, his face unreadable. And then quietly he said, "We must prevent it." Passepartout stared at him. "But monsieur, the schedule, we're already delayed. We must prevent it," Fogg repeated, and there was something in his voice, some note of absolute certainty, that silenced all objections. And so Phileas Fogg, a man who measured his life in minutes and prided himself on never deviating from a plan, made a choice that had nothing to do with schedules or wagers or logic. He chose compassion. He chose to act. The Mahout, when he understood what Fogg intended, shook his head vehemently, warning of danger, of priests and guards, of sacred rites that must not be interrupted. But Fogg's resolve was firm. They followed the procession at a distance, moving quietly through the jungle. As night fell, the procession stopped at a clearing where wood had been piled high for the pyre. Torches were lit. The drums beat louder. Fogg, Passepartout, and the Mahout crept closer, hidden in the shadows. They watched as the woman was led to the pyre, her hands bound, her expression distant, as though she had already departed this world. The priests chanted. The crowd, village men, guards armed with old muskets, waited in reverent silence. And then, just before the torches could be set to the wood, Passepartout moved. He was, after all, a man who had once been a circus acrobat. He darted forward, quick and low, vaulting over the guards before they could react. He reached the pyre, scooped the woman into his arms and ran, his heart pounding, his breath ragged. Shouts erupted. The guards scrambled to pursue. But Fogg and the Mahout had brought the elephant close, and Passepartout, with a strength born of desperation, lifted the unconscious woman onto the howdah and leapt up after her. The Mahout urged the elephant forward, and the great beast crashed through the jungle, trumpeting, unstoppable. Arrows hissed past. Voices shouted behind them. But the jungle swallowed them up, and soon the sounds of pursuit faded. They rode through the night, not stopping until dawn. The woman, freed from her bonds, woke slowly, confused and terrified. Passepartout tried to explain, his broken Hindi and frantic gestures barely coherent. Fogg spoke to her in English, his voice gentle, and to their surprise, she understood. She was educated, of royal blood, he would later learn. Her name was Ayuda. She stared at them, at these strange foreigners who had saved her life, and tears filled her eyes. She said something in Hindi, soft and trembling, and though Passepartout didn't understand the words, he understood the gratitude. Fogg merely nodded, as though rescuing women from funeral pyres was a routine part of traveling. "You are safe now," he said quietly. "We will take you to safety." And so their company grew from 2 to 3. Ayuda, bewildered and grateful, traveled with them as they continued their desperate race across India, every minute precious, every delay a threat to the impossible wager. But Phileas Fogg, who had risked everything to save a stranger, said nothing of the cost. He simply checked his watch, calculated the distance remaining, and urged the elephant onward through the bright, bewildering, beautiful country that stretched endlessly ahead. The elephant carried them onward through the green heart of India, the jungle alive with morning birdsong and the rustle of unseen creatures. Ayuda sat in the howdah, wrapped in a shawl Passepartout had given her, her eyes still wide with the shock of what had happened. She was alive. These strangers, these peculiar foreign men, had saved her from the flames. She watched Phileas Fogg with quiet wonder. He sat consulting his maps and schedules, his face calm, showing no sign of the danger they had just faced, no hint of pride or expectation of gratitude. He had rescued her as one might stop to help a fallen stranger on the street, not out of heroism, but simply because it was the right thing to do. "You risked your journey for me," she said softly in English, her voice accented but clear. Why? Fogg glanced up briefly. It was necessary, he said, as though that explained everything. By midday, they reached the far side of the gap where the railway resumed. The mahout bid them farewell, taking the elephant as his own. Fogg had already paid for the creature, after all. He bowed deeply to Ayuda, wishing her safety and fortune, and then he was gone, the elephant's swaying form disappearing back into the jungle. They boarded the train to Allahabad, and from there to Benares, the holy city on the Ganges. Ayuda traveled with them, still uncertain of her future but grateful beyond words. Fogg had determined that she had family in Hong Kong, distant relatives who would take her in. He would ensure she reached them safely. Passepartout, meanwhile, was bursting with the exhilaration of the rescue. He recounted the adventure to himself in whispers, marveling at his own courage, at the strangeness of fate. He had joined this journey expecting monotony and precision, and instead he had ridden an elephant through a jungle and saved a woman from death. Life, he thought, was far stranger than any novel. They reached Benares in the evening, the city glowing with countless lamps reflected in the sacred river. The train paused here for several hours before continuing to Calcutta, and Passepartout, restless and curious, decided to explore. Fogg, exhausted and intent on rest, remained in the carriage. He advised Passepartout not to wander far, to return well before the train's departure. Passepartout promised, and then, with Ayuda choosing to rest as well, he set off into the lamplit streets. Benares was overwhelming, a city of pilgrims and priests, of temples and ghats descending to the river where the faithful bathed in the holy waters. Incense smoke hung in the air, bells rang from distant shrines. Passepartout wandered, enchanted, through narrow lanes, past vendors and beggars, past musicians playing strange, haunting instruments. And then he saw it, a temple magnificent and ancient, its towers carved with gods and demons, its doorway open and inviting. Without thinking, driven by innocent curiosity, Passepartout stepped inside. The interior was dim and cool, lit by oil lamps. Statues of deities stood in shadowed alcoves. A priest chanted somewhere deeper within. Passepartout moved quietly, respectfully, marveling at the intricacy of the carvings, the age of the stone. And then he made a terrible mistake. He was still wearing his shoes. In Hindu temples, as in mosques and many sacred spaces throughout Asia, shoes are forbidden. It is a sign of respect, a recognition that one treads on holy ground. But Passepartout, in his ignorance, had not removed them. He had walked into the temple with his dusty European boots still on his feet. A shout rang out. Priests appeared from the shadows, furious, gesturing at his feet. Passepartout realized his error too late. He stammered apologies, backing toward the door, but the priests were not appeased. They seized him, their hands rough, their voices a torrent of angry Hindi he could not understand. He tried to explain, to apologize, but it was useless. They dragged him out into the street, where a crowd had begun to gather. Someone struck him, someone tore his coat. And then, in a panic, Passepartout broke free and ran, his heart hammering, his breath ragged. He ran through the streets, lost now, disoriented, pursued by shouts and the sound of footsteps. He ducked into an alley, climbed over a wall, and finally, gasping, collapsed in the shadows. He waited there, trembling, until the sounds of pursuit faded. When he finally returned to the train station, his clothes torn, his face bruised, he found Fogg waiting on the platform, his pocket watch in hand, his expression unreadable. "You are late," Fogg said mildly. Passepartout stammered out an explanation, the temple, the shoes, the priests, the chase. Fogg listened without interrupting, and when Passepartout finished, he simply nodded. "You are unharmed, which is what matters. However, your actions may have consequences. We will proceed to Calcutta as planned." The train departed Benares, and they settled into the rhythm of rail travel once more. But the consequences Fogg had anticipated came swiftly. The next morning, as the train pulled into Calcutta station, they were met by British police officers. Detective Fix stood among them, his expression grim and satisfied. "Mr. Phileas Fogg," one of the officers said. Fogg inclined his head. "I am he. You and your servant are under arrest for the desecration of a sacred temple in Benares. You will come with us." Passepartout went pale. This was his fault. His foolish curiosity had brought this disaster upon them. Fogg, however, remained utterly calm. "I did not enter the temple," Fogg said. "My servant did in ignorance, not malice. Nevertheless, sir, you are responsible for him. Please come with us." They were taken to a magistrate's court, a stuffy room filled with the weight of colonial bureaucracy. The priests from Benares had filed a complaint. Passepartout was guilty of sacrilege, and Fogg, as his employer, was held accountable. The magistrate, a weary British official, listened to the case with little interest. It was clear he found the entire matter tedious, but the law was the law. He imposed a fine, £300 for Passepartout, and an additional 150 for Fogg. Fogg paid without hesitation, his face betraying no emotion. The magistrate dismissed them, and they were free to go. But the delay had cost them precious hours. The steamer to Hong Kong, the Rangoon, was scheduled to depart at noon, and it was nearly that already. They raced through Calcutta's crowded streets, Aayuda hurrying alongside them, Passepartout carrying their bags, his face a mask of guilt and despair. They reached the docks just as the Rangoon's engines were beginning to rumble, the gangplank about to be raised. Fogg did not run, he never ran, but his stride was swift and purposeful. They boarded the steamer with minutes to spare, and as the great vessel pulled away from the dock, Passepartout sank onto a bench, his head in his hands. "Monsieur, I am so sorry," he whispered. "I have ruined everything." Fogg sat beside him, his expression unchanged. "You made an error. Errors happen. We are still on schedule, though the margin is narrower. Do not let guilt paralyze you. We continue." Passepartout looked up at his master, astonished by the lack of anger, the absence of recrimination. "You are not furious with me." "Fury," Fogg said quietly, "is a waste of energy. We move forward." Aayuda, watching this exchange, felt her admiration for Fogg deepen. Here was a man of extraordinary discipline, yes, but also of unexpected kindness. He had saved her life. He had forgiven his servant's mistake. He moved through the world with a calm strength that she found both mysterious and deeply reassuring. Detective Fix, who had also boarded the Rangoon, watched from a distance. The arrest in Benares had not been his doing. He had no jurisdiction over temple desecrations, but it had delayed Fogg, and Fix had hoped it might give him time for the bank robbery warrant to arrive. But it had not. The warrant was still somewhere in transit, lost in the slow machinery of international law. And so Fix could only watch and wait, a hunter circling his prey, unable yet to strike. The Rangoon was a fine steamer, smaller than the Mongolia but well-maintained and swift. She would carry them across the Bay of Bengal to Penang, then to Singapore, and finally to Hong Kong, a journey of some 2,000 miles. Fogg settled into his now familiar routine, meals at precise hours, walks on deck, whist in the saloon. Aayuda spent her time reading in the small ship's library or standing at the railing, watching the sea. She was still processing the enormity of what had happened, her husband's death, the terrible ritual she had been saved from, the sudden freedom that felt both like a gift and a burden. Passepartout, meanwhile, threw himself into making amends. He attended to Fogg's needs with even greater diligence, polished shoes to a mirror shine, ensured meals were served exactly on time. And he spent time with Aayuda, teaching her French phrases to pass the hours, making her laugh with his clumsy attempts at Hindi. The Rangoon steamed south along the Indian coast, then eastward across the open Bay of Bengal. The weather was fine at first, the sea calm, the sky a clear expanse of blue, but as they neared the Straits of Malacca, the wind began to rise. A storm was coming. The sky turned grey, then darker, the colour of bruised iron. The sea grew restless, the waves building. The captain, a cautious man, ordered the sails reefed and the hatches battened down. Passengers were advised to remain below. The storm struck with tropical fury. Rain lashed the decks. The wind howled. The Rangoon pitched and rolled, her engines straining, her hull groaning. Aayuda, frightened, clung to the edge of her bunk. Passepartout turned a delicate shade of green. Even Fogg, though he showed no fear, gripped the edge of the table to steady himself as the ship heaved. The storm lasted through the night and into the next day. The Rangoon fought her way forward, but she was slowed, the engines unable to make full speed against the wind and waves. Every hour of delay tightened the margin of Fogg's journey. When the storm finally broke, the sun emerged pale and exhausted, and the sea calmed to an uneasy swell. The captain assessed the damage, minor, thankfully, and announced that they would reach Singapore a full day late. Fogg consulted his schedule, his jaw tight. The delay meant they might miss the connection to Hong Kong. The margin was razor-thin now, but there was nothing to be done except wait and hope and trust that fortune, which had been so cruel in India, might show them mercy now. Fix, observing all this, felt a grim satisfaction. Delays favored him. The longer Fogg was delayed, the more time Fix had for the warrant to arrive. Justice, he told himself, was patient. The Rangoon limped into Singapore harbour at dawn, a full day behind schedule. Fogg, Ayuda and Passepartout disembarked swiftly, hoping to find passage to Hong Kong on any available vessel. And by a stroke of extraordinary luck, they did. A small steamer, the Tankadere, was leaving for Hong Kong within hours. Fogg negotiated passage, paid handsomely, and they boarded at once. The race continued, the world unfolding mile by mile, the clock ticking down with merciless precision. Ahead lay Hong Kong, and beyond that, Japan, America, and the vast Atlantic. Behind lay India, a country that had tested them, terrified them, and changed them in ways they were only beginning to understand. And Ayuda, sitting on the deck of the Tankadere as Singapore faded behind them, realized that she no longer thought of herself as a woman saved from death. She thought of herself, tentatively, hopefully, as a woman beginning a new life. The journey for her was not just a race against time. It was a journey towards something she could not yet name, but which felt, for the first time in months, like the possibility of hope. The Tankadere was a small vessel, a pilot boat built for speed rather than comfort. Her hull was sleek, her sails white and taut, her captain a weathered Chinese sailor named John Bunsby, who knew these waters as intimately as a man knows the lines of his own palm. When Fogg had offered him an extraordinary sum to sail directly to Hong Kong, bypassing the usual stops, Captain Bunsby had agreed without hesitation. They set sail from Singapore at midday, the little boat cutting through the green waters of the South China Sea with remarkable speed. The weather was fair, the wind favorable, and for the first time in days, Fogg allowed himself a cautious hope that they might still make the connection to the Pacific steamer in Hong Kong. Ayuda stood at the bow, the wind tugging at her dark hair, her face tilted toward the sun. She had borrowed European clothing from a kind passenger back in Calcutta, a simple dress of grey cotton, modest and practical. She looked different now, less like the young widow in ceremonial white, and more like a traveller finding her way in the world. Passepartout watched her with quiet admiration. She had borne so much, grief, terror, displacement, and yet there was a resilience in her, a quiet strength. She spoke little of her past, but when she did, her voice carried no bitterness, only a kind of wondering sadness. Fogg, too, watched her, though he would never have admitted it. He found himself noticing small things, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when she read, the soft gratitude in her voice when she thanked him for some small kindness, the way she smiled at Passepartout's jokes even when they made no sense. She was, he realized, remarkably composed for someone who had lost everything. The Tankadere sailed north, hugging the coast of the Malay Peninsula before striking out across open water. The days were warm, the nights cool and star-filled. Captain Bunsby proved to be a man of few words but great skill, navigating by stars and instinct, coaxing every ounce of speed from his little vessel. On the second day out, Ayuda and Fogg found themselves at the stern, watching the sun sink toward the horizon, painting the sea in shades of gold and crimson. "I have not properly thanked you," Ayuda said quietly, "for what you did, for saving my life." Fogg glanced at her, his expression as unreadable as ever. "Thanks are not necessary. Anyone would have done the same." "No," Ayuda said, her voice firm, "not anyone. Most would have looked away or told themselves it was not their concern. You risked your journey, your wager, perhaps your life." "Why?" Fogg was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. "Because it was the right thing to do, and because some things matter more than money." Ayuda studied his profile, the sharp lines of his face, the distant look in his eyes. "You are not the man people believe you to be," she said. "And what do people believe? That you are cold, unfeeling, a machine that calculates but does not care. And you do not believe this." "No," Ayuda said. "I think you feel deeply. You simply do not show it." Fogg said nothing, but something in his posture softened just slightly, and Ayuda knew she had touched something true. That night, a storm rose from the south. It was not as fierce as the one that had battered the Rangoon, but on a vessel as small as the Tankadere, it was terrifying. The wind screamed. The waves towered above the deck. The boat climbed each swell and plunged into the troughs beyond, water crashing over the rails, the timbers groaning. Captain Bunsby lashed himself to the wheel and fought the sea with grim determination. Fogg and Passepartout helped secure the rigging, their hands raw from the ropes, their clothes soaked through. Ayuda huddled below, her heart racing, praying to gods she was no longer sure she believed in. The storm lasted through the night, and when dawn finally broke, pale and watery, the Tankadere was still afloat, battered but unbroken. Captain Bunsby allowed himself a rare smile. "Good boat," he said. "She knows how to dance." But the storm had cost them time. The wind had blown them off course, and now they would have to tack westward to regain their heading. Hours, precious hours, slipped away. Fogg calculated the delay with his usual precision. They would still reach Hong Kong, but the margin was almost gone. If the Pacific steamer departed even an hour early, they would miss it. "We will make it," he said to Passepartout, though his voice held more determination than certainty. On the fifth day, the coast of China appeared on the horizon, green hills rising from the sea, islands scattered like jewels. The water grew busier with traffic, junks with their distinctive sails, fishing boats, merchant vessels. They were nearing Hong Kong. Captain Bunsby skillfully navigated the final approaches, and by evening they entered Victoria Harbour, one of the great ports of the East. The harbour was a forest of masts and smokestacks. Ships from every nation crowded together, the waterfront glittering with lights. The Tankadere docked, and Fogg paid Captain Bunsby the agreed sum, with a generous bonus for his skill and courage. Bunsby accepted with a bow, his weathered face creasing into a smile. They hurried to the offices of the steamship company. The clerk informed them that the Pacific steamer, the Carnatic, was still in port but would be leaving the next morning for Yokohama. Relief flooded through Passepartout. They had made it. Against all odds, they had made it. Fogg secured berths for the three of them and arranged for Ayuda to meet with her relatives in Hong Kong before the departure. He would ensure she was safely settled before continuing the journey. That evening, they dined at a hotel overlooking the harbour. It was the first proper meal they had enjoyed in days, and Passepartout ate with such enthusiasm that Ayuda laughed, a bright, genuine sound that made even Fogg's lips twitch in what might have been the ghost of a smile. Ayuda spoke of her family in Hong Kong, distant cousins she had never met. She was nervous, uncertain of the welcome she would receive. Fogg assured her that he would not leave until he was confident she was safe and provided for. "You have done so much for me already," Ayuda said, "more than I can ever repay." "There is no debt," Fogg replied. "You owe me nothing." But as he said it, he realized that he would miss her presence when they parted. She had brought something unexpected to the journey, warmth, humanity, a reminder that the world held more than schedules and steam engines. Later that night, Passepartout, restless and curious, wandered down to the docks to admire the Carnatic, the great steamer that would carry them across the Pacific. As he stood gazing up at her iron hull, a voice spoke behind him. "She's a beauty, isn't she?" Passepartout turned to find Detective Fix standing there, hands in pockets, his expression friendly. "Ah, Monsieur Fix," Passepartout exclaimed. He had encountered the detective several times during the journey, always by seeming chance, and had come to consider him a fellow traveler, perhaps even a friend. "Will you be sailing on the Carnatic?" Fix asked. "Yes, to Yokohama and then to San Francisco. We're making good time despite the delays." Fix smiled, though it did not reach his eyes. "I'm glad to hear it. Tell me, is Mr. Fogg well, and the young lady you rescued?" "Quite well, monsieur. My master is a remarkable man. Nothing troubles him." "Indeed, he must have nerves of steel." Fix paused, then said casually, "I wonder, though, does he ever speak of England?" "Of London, perhaps he misses it," Passepartout shrugged. "He does not speak of such things. He is very private." Fix nodded thoughtfully. "I see. Well, I should let you rest. Long journey ahead." They parted ways, and Passepartout returned to the hotel, unaware that Fix had no intention of letting Fogg reach Yokohama. The detective had learned that the arrest warrant was finally on its way, due to arrive in Hong Kong within days. If he could delay Fogg's departure, just delay it long enough for the warrant to arrive, he could make the arrest at last. And so Fix set into motion a plan. He found Passepartout the next morning and, with a show of great friendliness, suggested they explore the city together before the Carnatic's departure. He bought Passepartout drinks, showed him the sights, led him from one diversion to another, and then, in a dingy tavern in a back street, Fix slipped a sedative into Passepartout's drink. Passepartout, unsuspecting, drank deeply. Within minutes, the world began to spin. He tried to stand, stumbled, and collapsed. Fix caught him and eased him into a dark corner where he would sleep for hours, far too deeply to wake. By the time Passepartout woke, groggy and confused, the sun was setting. Panic seized him. The Carnatic, they were supposed to sail that morning. He staggered to the docks, his head pounding, and found the berth empty. The Carnatic was gone. Sailed that morning as scheduled without him, without them, or so he feared. Meanwhile, Fogg had spent the day accompanying Aayuda to her relatives' home. The reunion had been polite but cold. The relatives, wealthy merchants, had received Aayuda with courtesy but little warmth. They offered her a room, a place to stay, but there was no affection in their voices, no welcome in their eyes. Aayuda had accepted with quiet dignity, but as Fogg prepared to leave, she asked softly if she might speak with him alone. In the garden, beneath a blossoming tree, she said, "I do not wish to stay here." Fogg looked at her, surprised. "These are your family. By blood, perhaps, but they are strangers and they see me as a burden. I would prefer to continue with you if you would permit it. I could travel to Europe, perhaps find a new life there." Fogg hesitated. Taking Aayuda with them would be complicated, would add responsibility. But as he looked into her eyes, earnest and hopeful, he found he could not refuse. "Very well," he said. "You will come with us." Aayuda's face lit with relief and gratitude. Thank you. They returned to the hotel to collect Passepartout and their luggage, only to discover that Passepartout was missing. Fogg inquired at the docks and learned, to his shock, that the Carnatic had sailed hours ago. But then, more shocking still, the clerk corrected himself. No, wait. The Carnatic had sailed, yes, but not to Yokohama. She had been repaired a day early and had departed ahead of schedule the previous evening. The steamer now in port was the next one, scheduled to leave tomorrow. Fogg stood very still, processing this. They had not missed the ship. The ship had left early, and Passepartout was missing. They searched the city through the night, Fogg and Aayuda walking the streets, asking at taverns and hotels, growing more anxious with each passing hour. And finally, at dawn, they found him, slumped on a bench near the waterfront, just waking from his drugged stupor. "Monsieur," Passepartout gasped, staggering to his feet. "The ship, I'm so sorry, I don't know what happened." "The ship left yesterday," Fogg said calmly. "We did not miss it because we were never meant to board it, but there is another leaving tomorrow. We will take that." Passepartout stared at him, disbelieving. "You're not angry. I am concerned for your welfare. We will discuss what happened later. For now, rest." And so, by a stroke of fortune, or perhaps by the strange workings of fate, the journey continued. They had lost time, yes, but they had not lost hope. Detective Fix, watching from a distance, cursed under his breath. The warrant still had not arrived, and Fogg, impossibly, was still one step ahead. The race across the world continued, the clock ticking down, the miles spinning away beneath them, and the bond between Fogg and Aayuda, unspoken but undeniable, growing stronger with each passing day. Hong Kong in those days was a city of contrasts. British colonial order imposed upon Chinese vitality, a place where East and West collided and mingled in markets and harbors, in temples and trading houses. The streets teemed with life. Sedan chairs carried by coolies, merchants hawking silk and tea, British soldiers in their red coats, Chinese laborers in wide straw hats, the air thick with the smells of incense, fish, and coal smoke. Fogg, Aayuda, and Passepartout had a day before the next steamer to Yokohama would depart. The ship was called the General Grant, an American vessel, and she was scheduled to leave Hong Kong harbor the following afternoon. Fogg secured their passage and then set about ensuring that all was in order. Passepartout, still shaken by his lost hours and the mystery of how he had ended up drugged and unconscious, hovered close to Fogg, unwilling to wander off again. He felt the weight of his failures, the temple incident, now this. He was supposed to be the reliable servant, and instead he kept stumbling into disasters. But Fogg, as always, showed no anger, only a quiet patience that somehow made Passepartout feel worse. Aeuda, meanwhile, seemed lighter than she had in days. The decision to continue the journey, to not stay with relatives who did not want her, had lifted a burden. She walked through the streets of Hong Kong with a kind of cautious wonder, no longer a woman fleeing death, but a woman choosing her own path. Detective Fix, lurking in the shadows of the steamship office, was in a state of barely controlled frustration. The warrant still had not arrived. Days had passed. Weeks. He had followed Fogg across continents, through storms and delays, and still, the legal authority to make the arrest eluded him. He had tried to delay Fogg by drugging Passepartout, but that had backfired spectacularly when the Carnatic left early, and the travelers simply boarded a different ship. Now they were set to depart again, and Fix was no closer to his goal. But then, a desperate idea formed in his mind. If he could not arrest Fogg legally, perhaps he could delay him some other way. Perhaps he could separate Fogg from his companions, cause confusion, buy just enough time for the warrant to catch up. Fix began to watch, to wait, to look for an opportunity. That evening, Fogg and Aeuda dined at the hotel, while Passepartout went out briefly to purchase a few provisions for the voyage. Preserved meats, biscuits, a bottle of brandy in case of seasickness. He was determined to do something useful, to redeem himself in some small way. As he walked through the bustling market district, he encountered Detective Fix, who greeted him with the same false warmth he had shown before. "Passepartout, how fortunate to run into you. Are you well? I heard you had some trouble yesterday." Passepartout shrugged uncomfortably. I'm not sure what happened, monsieur. One moment I was exploring, and the next I woke up on a bench, hours gone. It's very strange." "Strange indeed," Fix said smoothly. "Perhaps you were robbed, drugged by thieves. These ports can be dangerous." "Perhaps," Passepartout said, though he did not really believe it. He had not been robbed. Nothing was missing. It was all very odd. Fix steered the conversation carefully. "I imagine Mr. Fogg is eager to continue the journey. The General Grant leaves tomorrow, does it not?" "Yes, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Plenty of time to rest then. Though I wonder," Fix paused, as though struck by a sudden thought. "I wonder if Mr. Fogg knows that the General Grant has been delayed. I heard at the docks that there's some issue with the boilers. They may need to postpone departure by a day." Passepartout's eyes widened. "Delayed, but that would ruin everything. We can't afford another delay." "I may be mistaken," Fix said quickly, "but I thought I heard the harbourmaster mention it. You should check, just to be certain. Wouldn't want to be caught unawares." Passepartout thanked him hastily and rushed off to the docks to verify this alarming news. Fix watched him go, a cold smile on his lips. It was, of course, a lie. The General Grant was on schedule, but Fix knew that Passepartout would waste time running around the docks, asking questions, and in that time, Fix would set his real plan in motion. He went to the steamship office and presented himself as a representative of Mr. Phileas Fogg. He explained that Mr. Fogg and his party had been delayed and would not be able to board the General Grant at the scheduled time. Could their luggage be removed from the ship and held until further notice? The clerk, seeing no reason to doubt this well-dressed, authoritative gentleman, agreed. The luggage was offloaded. Meanwhile, Passepartout reached the docks and spent an hour speaking with harbourmen, officials, and the General Grant's crew, all of whom assured him that the ship was on schedule, no delays, sailing tomorrow at 2 o'clock precisely. Relieved but confused, Passepartout hurried back to the hotel to report this to Fogg. He arrived breathless and found Fogg and Aeuda taking tea in the salon. "Monsieur," Passepartout said, "I've just come from the docks. The General Grant is on schedule. There's no delay." Fogg set down his teacup, his expression unchanging. "I did not think there was. Where did you hear otherwise?" Passepartout hesitated, a terrible suspicion beginning to form. From Monsieur Fix, the detective we've encountered so often during the journey." "Fix," Fogg repeated, his voice cold. Aeuda looked between them, sensing something wrong. "Who is this man?" "A detective from Scotland Yard," Fogg said quietly. "He has been following us since London. I suspected as much, though I did not speak of it. He believes I am the bank robber. He has been waiting for a warrant to arrest me." Passepartout went pale, "But monsieur, you are innocent. I am aware." But Fix does not believe that, and it seems he is growing desperate. Fogg rose from his chair, his movements deliberate. "We will board the General Grant early, immediately if possible. I will not give Fix another opportunity to interfere." They packed swiftly and made their way to the docks, only to discover the next obstacle. Their luggage had been removed from the ship on the orders of a gentleman claiming to represent Mr. Fogg. The ship's officer apologized profusely, but the damage was done. The luggage was somewhere in the harbor's storage warehouses, and retrieving it would take time they did not have. Fogg made a swift decision. "Leave the luggage, we will board without it." "But monsieur," Passepartout protested, "our clothes, our provisions, can be replaced." "Time cannot, we board now." And so they boarded the General Grant with nothing but the clothes on their backs, their documents, and the money Fogg carried in his satchel. It was a strange, almost liberating feeling to be stripped of possessions, to travel light and unencumbered. The General Grant was a grand ship, larger and more modern than the steamers they had taken across the Indian and Eastern seas. She was built for the Pacific crossing, sturdy and well-appointed, with spacious cabins and a dining saloon that could seat 50. As they settled into their cabin, Aeuda had her own small room adjacent to the one Fogg and Passepartout shared. The ship's horn sounded. The General Grant was preparing to depart. On the dock below, Detective Fix stood watching, his face twisted with frustration. He had delayed them, sabotaged them, lied to them, and still they were leaving. Fogg was slipping through his fingers like water. In a moment of reckless desperation, Fix made a decision. He ran up the gangplank just as it was being raised and flung himself aboard the General Grant. He would follow Fogg to Japan, to America, to England itself if necessary. He had come this far. He would not give up now. The General Grant steamed out of Victoria Harbour, her great paddle wheels churning, her smokestacks trailing black plumes into the sky. Hong Kong receded into the distance, its green hills, its crowded harbour, its chaos and vitality fading into the afternoon haze. Fogg stood at the railing, watching the city disappear. Beside him, Aeuda stood in silence, her expression thoughtful. "Do you regret it?" Fogg asked quietly. "Leaving your homeland behind?" Aeuda considered this. India was her homeland, yes, but it was also the place where she had lost everything, her husband, her family, very nearly her life. "I regret the losses," she said, "but I do not regret moving forward. Sometimes the only way to heal is to leave the old wounds behind." Fogg nodded, understanding more than he said. "And you?" Aeuda asked. "Do you regret this journey, all the complications, the delays, the dangers?" Fogg was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "When I made the wager, I thought this was about time, about precision, about proving a point. But I have learned something these past weeks. I have learned that the unexpected is not always an obstacle. Sometimes it is a gift." He did not look at her as he said it, but Aeuda knew, with a certainty that made her heart ache, that he was speaking about her, about the rescue, about the choice to bring her along. She wanted to say something, to tell him that she felt the same, that this journey had given her a life she thought she had lost. But the words caught in her throat, too large, too fragile. Instead, she simply stood beside him, their shoulders nearly touching, and watched the sea unfold before them, endless and blue. Below decks, Detective Fix found a third-class berth and tried to convince himself that he had not lost his mind. He was following a suspect across the Pacific Ocean without legal authority, without a warrant, without any certainty that he would ever be able to make the arrest. But he had to believe that justice would prevail, that the truth would come to light, that Phileas Fogg was guilty, and that Fix would be the one to prove it. The General Grant sailed north toward Japan, cutting through the waters of the East China Sea. The weather was fine, the sea calm. Passengers settled into the routines of shipboard life, meals at regular hours, walks on deck, card games in the saloon. Fogg resumed his whist games, playing with the same quiet skill. Aeuda spent her time reading and watching the ocean, content in her solitude. Passepartout explored the ship, made friends with the crew, and tried to shake the uneasy feeling that something was still wrong, that someone was still watching them. He did not yet know that Detective Fix was aboard, but he would find out soon enough. The days passed in a rhythm of waves and wind, of sunrises and sunsets. The General Grant steamed steadily northward, her engines tireless, her course true. And on the morning of the sixth day, land appeared on the horizon, a line of green hills, a coastline shrouded in mist. Japan. Passepartout stood at the railing, his heart pounding with excitement. He had heard of Japan, the mysterious island nation, closed to the world for centuries until only recently. He had heard of its temples and cherry blossoms, its samurai and tea ceremonies, its beauty and strangeness. And now, here it was, rising from the sea like a dream. The General Grant steamed into the harbor of Yokohama, the port city that served as Japan's gateway to the world. The harbor was busy but orderly, filled with ships of many nations. Beyond the docks, the city spread out, low wooden buildings with curved roofs, streets lined with paper lanterns, the distant shape of Mount Fuji rising against the sky, its peak white with snow. Fogg consulted his itinerary. They would be in Yokohama for less than a day. The next steamer, bound for San Francisco, would depart that evening. They had just enough time to see something of the city, to glimpse this strange and beautiful land, before continuing their relentless race across the world. Aoyuda looked at Fogg, hope in her eyes. "May we explore a little? I have always wanted to see Japan." Fogg, who never deviated from schedules, who measured his life in minutes, hesitated. And then, surprisingly, he nodded. "We have a few hours. Let us see what there is to see." And so, for the first time in the entire journey, Phileas Fogg allowed himself to be a tourist, to wander without purpose, to experience rather than simply endure. The world, vast and turning, awaited them. And for a few precious hours, they forgot the wager, forgot the pursuit, forgot everything but the beauty of streets lined with cherry trees, the scent of incense from distant temples, and the quiet joy of being, for a moment, simply travelers in a world full of wonder. Yokohama in the autumn of 1872 was a city caught between worlds, an ancient culture opening itself, hesitantly, to the modern age. The Meiji Restoration was only 4 years old, and Japan, after centuries of isolation, was learning to walk in step with the Western powers. Fogg, Aoyuda, and Passepartout stepped off the General Grant into a city that felt dreamlike, utterly unlike anything they had seen before. The architecture was low and graceful, buildings of wood and paper with curving roofs, so different from the stone and brick of Europe. Paper lanterns hung from eaves, swaying gently in the breeze. The streets were clean, orderly, the people moving with a quiet courtesy that seemed almost choreographed. Passepartout was enchanted. He stared at everything, the women in their silk kimonos, their hair elaborately arranged and adorned with ornaments, the men in traditional hakama, or increasingly Western suits, the merchants selling rice cakes and dried fish, the rickshaws pulled by runners who moved with swift, tireless grace. Fogg had secured lodging at a modest inn near the harbor, and after ensuring that Aoyuda was comfortably settled, he consulted his schedule. The steamer to San Francisco, a ship called the Columbia, would depart at 8 o'clock that evening. They had approximately 6 hours. "We should rest," Fogg said, ever practical, but Aoyuda, her eyes bright, said, "Or we could see the city. When will any of us be in Japan again?" Fogg looked at her, surprised by the eagerness in her voice. And then, to Passepartout's astonishment, he nodded. "Very well, a brief tour. But we must return in time for the departure." They set out into the streets of Yokohama, 3 travelers adrift in a world of wonders. They walked through the merchant district, where shops displayed silk, lacquerware, porcelain, and intricately folded paper creations. Passepartout bought a small folding fan as a souvenir, marveling at the delicate painting on its surface, cherry blossoms and a distant mountain. They passed a temple, its gates guarded by stone lions, its courtyard serene and shadowed. Aoyuda asked if they might enter, and Fogg agreed. They removed their shoes at the entrance. Passepartout made very sure to do so, having learned his lesson in India, and walked quietly through the sacred space. The temple was peaceful, dim and cool, the air scented with incense. A monk in saffron robes sat in meditation, utterly still. Candles flickered before statues of the Buddha, their faces serene, their hands arranged in gestures of blessing and teaching. Aoyuda stood before one of the statues, her hands pressed together in a gesture of respect. She had been raised Hindu, but grief and displacement had shaken her faith. Now, in this quiet place, she felt something settle in her heart, not the return of old beliefs, but a sense of peace, of acceptance. The world was vast and full of sorrow, yes, but also full of beauty and unexpected grace. Fogg stood beside her, silent, and when she glanced at him, she saw that his eyes were closed, his face uncharacteristically soft. Perhaps he, too, felt the temple's peace. Perhaps even a man of clockwork precision could be moved by the sacred. They left the temple and continued their wandering. They found a market where vendors sold strange fruits, pickled vegetables, and fish so fresh they were still moving. Passepartout tried a skewer of grilled eel and declared it delicious. Aeuda sampled mochai, sweet rice cakes filled with red bean paste, and smiled at the taste. Fogg, to everyone's surprise, purchased a small wooden box inlaid with mother of pearl. When Passepartout asked what it was for, Fogg merely said, "A reminder," of what he did not say. They climbed a hill on the edge of the city, a path lined with stone lanterns, and from the summit, they could see the whole of Yokohama spread below, the harbor crowded with ships, the city's rooftops, the green hills beyond. And in the distance, rising like a ghost in the afternoon haze, Mount Fuji, its perfect cone capped with snow, serene and eternal. Aeuda caught her breath. "It's beautiful." "Yes," Fogg said quietly, and he meant it. They stood there for a long moment, the three of them, looking out over this strange and lovely land, and for once, no one spoke of schedules or wages or time. They simply stood and breathed and were. But time, of course, does not stop for wonder. As they descended the hill, heading back toward the harbor, they encountered a commotion in the streets. A crowd had gathered, and from within it came music, drums and flutes, discordant and urgent. A procession was passing through, a festival of some kind, and the street was blocked. Fogg checked his watch. They had less than 2 hours before the Columbia's departure. They needed to return to the inn, collect their few belongings, and board the ship. But the procession filled the street entirely, and there was no way through. Passepartout tried to push forward, but the crowd was too thick, and besides, it seemed rude to shove past what was clearly a sacred or ceremonial event. They waited, growing more anxious by the minute. Finally, the procession passed, men in demon masks, dancers in elaborate costumes, a portable shrine carried on the shoulders of young men chanting in unison. The crowd began to disperse, and Fogg led the way swiftly back toward the harbor. They reached the inn, gathered their scant belongings, and hurried to the docks. The Columbia was there, a magnificent American steamer, her smokestacks already beginning to puff steam in preparation for departure. The gangplank was still down, passengers still boarding. They made their way up the gangplank with minutes to spare, and as they stepped aboard, Passepartout let out a long breath of relief. "We made it," he said, laughing a little wildly. "We actually made it." Fogg merely consulted his watch and nodded. On schedule. The Columbia was a grand vessel, built for the long Pacific crossing to San Francisco. She was American-owned and American-run, her crew cheerful and efficient, her accommodations comfortable. The dining saloon was spacious, the cabins well-appointed, and there was even a small library stocked with popular novels and newspapers. As the ship pulled away from Yokohama, Passepartout stood at the stern, watching Japan recede into the twilight. He felt a strange sadness. They had been there for only a few hours, had seen only the tiniest fraction of the country, and yet he felt as though he was leaving something precious behind. Aeuda joined him at the railing. "Do you think we'll ever return?" she asked. "I don't know," Passepartout said honestly, "but I hope so." They stood in companionable silence as the lights of Yokohama faded and the vast, dark Pacific spread out before them. The crossing from Yokohama to San Francisco was the longest leg of the entire journey, more than 4,000 miles of open ocean. The Columbia would take them east across the Pacific, following the Great Circle route, a journey of approximately 3 weeks. For the first few days, the weather was fine. The sea was calm, the sky a clear blue dome, the ship steaming steadily eastward. Passengers settled into the rhythms of ocean travel, meals at regular hours, walks on deck, entertainments in the saloon. Fogg resumed his whist games, finding partners among the American businessmen and British diplomats aboard. He played with his usual precision, winning more often than not, his face betraying nothing. Aeuda spent her days reading, sewing, and walking the deck. She had purchased fabric in Yokohama, and now, with Passepartout's help, She was attempting to sew herself a new dress, as she had left most of her clothing behind in Hong Kong. The work was meditative, the slow rhythm of needle and thread soothing. Passepartout, ever restless, explored every inch of the ship. He made friends with the American crew, who found his French accent charming and his enthusiasm infectious. He learned the names of all the ship's officers, the workings of the paddle wheels, the intricacies of the steam engines. He even convinced the cook to teach him how to make apple pie, a quintessentially American dish. One evening, about a week into the journey, Fogg and Ayuda stood on deck together, watching the sun set over the endless ocean. The sky was ablaze with color, gold and crimson and violet, the clouds lit from below as though the world itself were on fire. "I have been thinking," Ayuda said quietly, "about what I will do when we reach San Francisco, and after." Fogg glanced at her, his expression attentive. "I thought I might stay in America," she continued. "Perhaps find work, perhaps teach. My English is good and I am educated. I could make a life there, I think." "You could," Fogg agreed. "Or," she looked at him, hopeful, anxious, or you could come to England. London is a great city. There are opportunities there as well, and," he paused, the words difficult, unfamiliar, "and it would be a comfort to know you were safely settled." Ayuda's heart swelled. She understood what he was really saying, the unspoken message beneath the formal words. He cared about her welfare. He wanted her near. "I will consider it," she said softly. "Thank you." They stood in silence, the sunset fading, the first stars appearing in the deepening sky. And though neither of them spoke of it, both understood that something had shifted between them, some barrier crossed, some silent acknowledgement made. Meanwhile, below decks, Detective Fix sat in his cramped third-class cabin, plotting his next move. He had learned that the Columbia would stop briefly in San Francisco to discharge passengers and cargo before continuing on to other American ports. Once they landed, Fogg would board a train across the continent to New York, and from there, a steamer to Liverpool. Fix had sent yet another telegram from Yokohama, begging for the warrant to be sent to San Francisco. Surely, it would arrive there. Surely he would finally be able to make the arrest and end this interminable chase. But a small, nagging doubt had begun to grow in Fix's mind. He had been so certain, so absolutely convinced that Phileas Fogg was the bank robber. The timing, the description, the sudden flight from England, it all fit. But the more he watched Fogg, the more he saw a man of honor, a man who had risked his fortune and his life to save a stranger, who treated his servant with respect, who moved through the world with a quiet integrity that did not seem to belong to a criminal. What if, Fix thought with growing dread, what if he was wrong? But no, he could not be wrong. The description matched, the timing matched. Fogg was guilty, he had to be. Fix pushed the doubt away and focused on the task ahead. San Francisco. The warrant would be there, justice would be done. The Columbia sailed on, day after day, the Pacific stretching endlessly in all directions. They crossed the international date line, that invisible boundary where yesterday becomes tomorrow, where time itself seems to fold and bend. The ship's captain made an announcement, explaining the phenomenon, and passengers adjusted their calendars accordingly. Fogg noted the date carefully in his journal. Every detail mattered. Every calculation must be precise. And then, on the morning of the 23rd day out from Yokohama, land appeared on the horizon. A faint line, grey and hazy but unmistakable. America. Passepartout rushed to the railing, his heart pounding. The new world. The land of opportunity, of vast wilderness, of gold rushes and railways spanning deserts and mountains. He had dreamed of seeing America, and now, here it was, rising from the sea. The Columbia steamed into San Francisco Bay, passing through the Golden Gate, and the city spread out before them. A booming, chaotic place clinging to steep hills, its waterfront crowded with ships, its streets thronged with miners and merchants, gamblers and dreamers. Fogg consulted his itinerary. They would have only a few hours in San Francisco before the train to New York departed. The Transcontinental Railway, completed just 3 years earlier, would carry them across the vast width of America, across mountains and deserts, prairies and rivers, in a journey of 7 days. Everything was still on schedule. The wager was still within reach. But as they disembarked onto American soil, none of them knew that the greatest challenges of the journey still lay ahead, that the vast, wild continent before them would test them in ways they could not yet imagine. The Columbia's horn sounded a long, mournful note, bidding farewell to the travelers who stepped onto the docks of San Francisco, their eyes wide, their hearts hopeful, their journey far from over. San Francisco in 1872 was a city of gold and chaos, built on the dreams of 49ers and the fortunes made and lost in the Sierra Nevada mountains. The waterfront roared with activity, stevedores unloading cargo, merchants shouting prices, sailors on shore leave stumbling between taverns, the air thick with salt and smoke, and the restless energy of a city that never stopped moving. Fogg, Ayuda, and Passepartout made their way through the crowded streets toward the railway station. They had only 2 hours before the departure of the Pacific Railroad train that would carry them east across the continent. San Francisco impressed Passepartout with its raw vitality, so different from the ancient cities of Europe or Asia. Everything here felt new, hastily built, as though the city itself were still being invented. Wooden buildings crowded against brick ones. Streets climbed impossibly steep hills. Cable cars clanged past, pulled by underground cables, a marvel of engineering. Fogg, as always, seemed unmoved by the spectacle. He was focused entirely on the schedule. The train would depart at 6 o'clock. They must be aboard by then. As they neared the station, Detective Fix caught up with them. He had been waiting, watching, hoping against hope that the warrant would be at the telegraph office. It was not. Fix's frustration had reached a breaking point. He had followed Fogg across the entirety of Asia and the Pacific, and still, the legal authority to make the arrest eluded him. Now they were in America, and soon they would cross the continent and reach the Atlantic. If he did not act soon, Fogg would escape entirely. In desperation, Fix decided to reveal himself. He approached Fogg on the platform of the railway station, his expression grave. "Mr. Fogg," he said, "we need to speak." Fogg turned, his face impassive. "Detective Fix. I wondered when you would make your presence official." Fix blinked, surprised. "You knew I was following you. I suspected from the beginning. You have been singularly persistent. What is it you want?" Fix took a breath. "I believe you are the man who robbed the Bank of England. I have been waiting for a warrant to arrest you, but it has not arrived. Nevertheless, I am asking you to surrender yourself to the authorities here in San Francisco." Fogg regarded him with something approaching pity. "I am not the bank robber, Mr. Fix. You have wasted your time and considerable effort chasing an innocent man." "So you say, but the description matches, the timing matches. And an innocent man would not flee the country so hastily." "I did not flee, I made a wager. The difference is significant." Fix's jaw tightened. "Will you come with me voluntarily?" "No," Fogg said simply. "I will board my train and continue my journey. If you wish to stop me, you will need legal authority, which you do not possess." For a moment, the two men stood facing each other, locked in silent conflict. And then the train's whistle blew, sharp and urgent, and Fogg turned and walked calmly toward the waiting carriages, Ayuda and Passepartout following. Fix stood on the platform, fists clenched, watching them go. He could not stop them, not without a warrant, not without breaking the very laws he had sworn to uphold. And so he made yet another desperate decision. He would follow them across America. He would send another telegram from New York, begging for the warrant to meet them in Liverpool. He was in too deep to stop now. The train that would carry them across America was a marvel of the age, the Pacific Railroad, connecting the coasts of the vast continent for the first time in history. Completed in 1869, the railroad had been built by thousands of laborers, many of them Chinese and Irish immigrants, laying track across deserts and mountains, blasting tunnels through granite, spanning rivers with iron bridges. The train was long and powerful, its locomotive a gleaming black beast that huffed steam and smoke. The passenger carriages were comfortable, with cushioned seats and large windows, designed for the 7-day journey across the wilderness. Fogg, Ayuda, and Passepartout settled into their seats as the train pulled out of San Francisco Station, the city falling away behind them. Within an hour, they had left civilization entirely and entered the wild, open country of the American West. The landscape was like nothing they had seen before. They crossed the Sacramento Valley, flat and golden with harvested wheat fields. They climbed into the Sierra Nevada, the train laboring up steep grades, the mountains rising around them, granite peaks, deep gorges, forests of pine and fir. Passepartout pressed his face to the window, astonished. "Monsieur, it's like the Alps but bigger, wilder." Fogg glanced out briefly, acknowledged the view with a nod, and returned to his newspaper. But Ayuda watched the mountains with quiet wonder, marveling at the scale, the grandeur, the sheer untamed beauty of it all. They climbed higher and higher, the air growing thin and cold. The train passed through snowsheds, long wooden tunnels built to protect the tracks from avalanches. They crossed gorges on trestle bridges that seemed impossibly fragile, the wheels clattering over gaps where far below, rivers rushed white with foam. And then they crested the summit and began the long descent into Nevada. The landscape changed dramatically. The forests gave way to high desert, sagebrush and red rock, vast empty plains under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The train sped across this emptiness, the loneliness broken only by occasional stations, rough settlements of a few wooden buildings clinging to the tracks like driftwood. Fogg maintained his routine even on the train. He took his meals at precise hours in the dining car, where they served roast beef and potatoes, cornbread and apple pie, hearty American fare. He walked the length of the train at regular intervals for exercise. He played cards with fellow passengers in the evenings. Ayuda spent much of her time reading or gazing out the window. The vastness of America astounded her. She had thought India was large, but America seemed infinite, a land that stretched beyond comprehension. Passepartout, meanwhile, befriended everyone, the conductor, the porters, the other passengers. He learned that many of them were traveling west to seek their fortunes, some as miners, some as farmers, some simply as adventurers drawn by the promise of open land and new beginnings. It was a nation of dreamers, he realized, and he found their optimism contagious. On the third day, they crossed into Utah, passing through Salt Lake City, where the Mormons had built their desert Zion. The city was orderly and clean, a stark contrast to the wild mining towns they had passed through earlier. On the fourth day, they entered Wyoming, crossing the Continental Divide, the spine of the continent, where water on one side flowed to the Pacific and water on the other side flowed to the Atlantic. The train climbed to over 7,000 feet, the air thin, the land barren and windswept. It was here, in the vast empty country of the Wyoming Territory, that disaster struck. The train was crossing a stretch of open prairie when Passepartout, looking out the window, saw something that made his blood run cold. A vast herd of buffalo, thousands upon thousands of them, was crossing the tracks ahead, a living river of shaggy brown bodies stretching from horizon to horizon. The train began to slow. The engineer sounded the whistle, a long, desperate blast, hoping to frighten the buffalo away. But the animals paid no attention. They simply kept moving, a great migration following some instinct older than human understanding. The train slowed to a crawl, then stopped entirely, unable to proceed. The buffalo flowed around it like water around a stone, their hooves thundering, their breath steaming in the cold air. Passengers crowded to the windows, some in wonder, some in frustration. Fogg consulted his watch, his expression tightening. Every minute they stood still was a minute lost, a minute closer to failure. The buffalo took 3 hours to pass. 3 hours. When the last of them had crossed and the train could finally move again, Fogg recalculated the schedule. They had lost time, yes, but it could still be recovered if there were no further delays. But there would be further delays. That night, as they crossed into Nebraska, the train was attacked. It began with shouts from the front of the train, then gunfire. Passengers rushed to the windows and saw riders on horseback keeping pace with the train, whooping and shooting. Some of them leaped from their horses onto the train itself, clambering over the roofs of the carriages. Sioux warriors. The American frontier was not yet fully settled, and conflicts between native tribes and the encroaching railroad were frequent and violent. The Sioux, defending their land and their way of life, saw the railroad as an invasion, a desecration. The attack was swift and chaotic. The warriors fought with desperation, with fury, with the knowledge that this was a war they were losing. Some sought to stop the train, to derail it, to drive the invaders from their land. Others sought simply to make the railroad pay for its trespass. The conductor, a grizzled man who had survived many such attacks, shouted for the passengers to get down, to stay away from the windows. Gunfire crackled. Arrows hissed through the air. Fogg, remarkably calm, drew Ayuda away from the window and shielded her with his body. Passepartout grabbed a rifle from a fallen guard and joined the defense, shooting not to kill but to drive the attackers back. The battle lasted 20 minutes, though it felt like hours. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the attack ended. The warriors, having made their point, having taken what they sought, wheeled their horses and rode away into the darkness, vanishing like ghosts. When the train finally stopped at the next station, a rough outpost called Fort Kearney, the damage was assessed. Several passengers were wounded, though none killed. But worse, far worse, 3 men, including Passepartout, were missing. In the chaos of the attack, they had been captured. Fogg stood on the platform, his face frozen, his mind racing. Passepartout was gone, taken by the Sioux, carried off into the wilderness. The station captain, a cavalry officer, shook his head grimly. "I can send a patrol, but I can't promise we'll find them. The Sioux know this land. They can vanish like smoke." Fogg looked at the train, which was preparing to depart to continue east. If he stayed to search for Passepartout, he would miss the connection. He would lose the wager. Everything he had traveled for, everything he had endured, would be for nothing. And yet, there was no hesitation, no calculation. Fogg simply said, "I will go after him myself." Ayuda grasped his arm. "You can't. The wager. Passepartout is worth more than any wager," Fogg said quietly. And in that moment, Ayuda understood the true measure of the man she had come to love. Fogg hired a guide, a scout who knew the territory, and set out on horseback into the frozen prairie, following the tracks left by the raiding party. Ayuda, against all advice, insisted on coming with him. She would not be left behind. And so they rode into the wilderness, leaving the train and the schedule and the race against time behind, choosing instead to ride toward loyalty, toward friendship, toward the things that mattered more than money. The Nebraska prairie in late autumn was a cold, desolate place. The grassland stretched endlessly in all directions, brown and lifeless, the horizon broken only by the occasional rise or dry creek bed. The wind blew without mercy, cutting through coats and scarves, carrying with it the promise of winter. Fogg and Ayuda rode with the cavalry patrol that the fort commander had finally agreed to send out. There were 30 soldiers, hardened men who knew this country and knew the dangers it held. They rode swiftly, following the trail left by the Sioux raiding party, tracks in the frost-hardened earth, broken grass, the occasional dropped item. Fogg rode in grim silence, his face set with determination. The wager meant nothing now. Only Passepartout mattered, the loyal servant who had followed him across continents, who had stumbled and erred but never wavered in his devotion. To abandon him now would be unconscionable. Ayuda rode beside him, wrapped in a borrowed military coat, her face pale but resolved. She had insisted on coming despite the danger, and Fogg had not argued. She had courage, this woman, more courage than most men he had known. The patrol followed the trail for hours, into the afternoon, as the sun sank low and cold toward the horizon. And then, as they crested a rise, they saw it. A Sioux encampment in a sheltered valley, perhaps 100 teepees arranged in a circle, smoke rising from cooking fires, horses corralled nearby. The cavalry captain studied the camp through a spyglass. "They're there," he said quietly. "Your man and the others. I can see them, bound near the center of the camp." Fogg took the spyglass and looked. And yes, there they were, Passepartout and the other 2 captured passengers, tied to stakes, guarded but apparently unharmed. "What do you suggest?" Fogg asked the captain. The captain lowered the spyglass, his expression troubled. "We're outnumbered 2 to 1. A direct attack would be suicide, but we might be able to create a distraction, draw most of their warriors away, and then slip in and free the prisoners." "Then let us do so," Fogg said. They waited for nightfall. As the sky darkened and stars began to prick the blackness above, the soldiers prepared. Half of them would circle around to the far side of the camp and create a disturbance, gunfire, shouts, the appearance of an attack. The other half, including Fogg, would use the distraction to slip into the camp and free the prisoners. It was a desperate plan, risky and fragile, but it was the only plan they had. Ayuda insisted on staying with Fogg. "I can help," she said. "I can move quietly, and they will not expect a woman." Fogg wanted to refuse, to keep her safe, but he saw the determination in her eyes and knew it would be useless to argue. "Stay close to me," he said. "And if things go wrong, run, do not look back." She nodded, though they both knew she would do no such thing. The distraction began just after midnight. Gunfire erupted on the far side of the camp and shouts rang out. The Sioux warriors, thinking they were under attack, grabbed weapons and rushed to defend their families. Chaos erupted, torches were lit, dogs barked, children cried. And in the confusion, Fogg, Ayuda, and a handful of soldiers crept into the camp from the opposite side. They moved like shadows, low and silent, between the teepees. The camp was a maze of canvas and firelight, of moving figures and shouting voices. Fogg's heart pounded, but his movements were steady, precise. They found the prisoners near the center of the camp, just as the captain had said. Passepartout was tied to a stake, his face bruised but his eyes bright with hope when he saw Fogg approaching. "Monsieur," he whispered urgently, "I knew you'd come." "Be silent," Fogg said, cutting the ropes with a knife one of the soldiers had given him. "Can you walk? I can run," Passepartout said. They freed the other two prisoners and then began the desperate retreat back toward the edge of the camp. But they had been seen. A shout went up. Warriors turned, saw the intruders, and gave chase. Fogg grabbed Ayuda's hand and ran. They sprinted through the camp, dodging between teepees, leaping over fire pits, the sound of pursuit thundering behind them. Gunfire cracked. Arrows hissed past. They reached the horses, vaulted into the saddles, and rode hard into the darkness, the soldiers covering their retreat. The chase continued for miles, the Sioux warriors pursuing them relentlessly on horseback. But the cavalry horses were fresh, and eventually, as the sky began to lighten with the first grey hint of dawn, the pursuit fell away. They had escaped, all of them. Against all odds, they had succeeded. The patrol returned to Fort Kearney by mid-morning, exhausted, battered, but alive. Passepartout embraced Fogg, too overcome with gratitude to speak. Fogg, uncharacteristically, clasped his shoulder and said quietly, "I am glad you are safe." Ayuda, watching this, felt her heart swell. Here was the man the world thought was cold and unfeeling. Here was the man who had risked everything, his fortune, his life, his impossible wager, to save his servant. But the rescue had cost them dearly in time. The train they were meant to catch had long since departed. The next train would not arrive for hours, and even when it did, they would be days behind schedule. Fogg consulted his itinerary, his expression grim. The margin was gone. They were now behind, and the only way to recover the lost time would be to find a faster route across the remaining distance to New York. The fort commander, grateful for the successful rescue, suggested a solution. "There's a sledge railway being built across the plains, meant for winter supply runs. It's not fully operational, but you might be able to use it. It'll be rough, but it's fast." Fogg seized on the idea immediately. They hired a sledge, essentially a large sled pulled by horses, and a driver willing to make the desperate journey across the frozen prairie. And so they set out again, this time not on rails but on runners, the sledge skimming across the icy ground at breakneck speed. The wind howled, snow began to fall. They huddled beneath blankets as the horses strained, and the driver urged them onward with shouts and cracks of the whip. It was a brutal journey, days of cold and exhaustion, sleeping in rough shelters or not at all, eating dried meat and hard bread. But the sledge was fast, faster than the train, and mile by mile, they clawed back the lost time. Ayuda, wrapped in furs, her face wind-burned, looked at Fogg with something approaching awe. Nothing stopped him. Not storms, not delays, not disasters. He simply adapted and continued. Passepartout, guilt-ridden over the delay he had caused, tried to apologize again and again, but Fogg silenced him gently. "You were taken through no fault of your own. I would do the same again without hesitation. Now rest and prepare for the next leg of the journey." After 3 days of sledge travel, they reached Omaha, where the railway resumed. They boarded a train bound for Chicago, and from there, another train to New York. The landscape changed as they traveled east, the vast prairies giving way to farmland, the farmland to forests, the forests to towns and cities growing denser and more frequent. They passed through Illinois, through Indiana and Ohio, through Pennsylvania, the land greening as they neared the coast. Fogg was calculating constantly now, checking his watch against the schedule, counting the hours. They were still behind, but only by a little. If they could catch the next steamer from New York to Liverpool, If that steamer left on time, if there were no further delays, they might still make it. Might. On the evening of December 11th, the train pulled into New York City, that great roaring metropolis on the edge of the Atlantic. The city was enormous, chaotic, alive with energy. Gaslit streets teemed with carriages and crowds. Buildings rose higher here than anywhere they had seen, towers of brick and iron reaching toward the sky. But Fogg had no time to appreciate it. He went immediately to the steamship offices to inquire about passage to Liverpool, and there he received devastating news. The steamer he had planned to take, the China, had departed that morning 9 hours ago. The next steamer would not leave for 2 days. 2 days, it was too long. Even if they took the next steamer, even if it made the crossing at record speed, they would not reach Liverpool in time to make the journey to London before the deadline. Fogg stood on the docks of New York, staring out at the Atlantic, and for the first time his composure cracked. Not visibly, his face remained calm, his posture upright. But Ayuda, who had come to read his silences, saw the defeat in his eyes. "It's over," he said quietly. "The wager is lost." But Passepartout, the optimist, the dreamer, refused to accept it. "Monsieur, there must be a way. Another ship, a faster ship, something." Fogg shook his head. "There is nothing." And yet, even as he said it, he noticed a small vessel moored nearby, a trading ship, her sails furled, her crew loading cargo. He approached the captain, a weathered Englishman, and asked if the ship was bound for Europe. "Bordeaux," the captain said, "leaving tomorrow." "I will pay you to take us to Liverpool instead," Fogg said. "Name your price." The captain laughed. "Liverpool's out of my way, and I've got cargo contracted for Bordeaux. Can't break a contract for any price." "How much is the cargo worth?" Fogg asked. The captain named a figure. Fogg, without hesitation, offered double, triple. Whatever it would take. The captain's eyes widened. This madman was serious. "You'd pay that much just to reach Liverpool a few days sooner?" "I would," the captain considered. It was an absurd amount of money, life-changing money. And all he had to do was change course. "All right," he said finally. "We leave at dawn, but I want half the money up front." Fogg paid without hesitation, counting out banknotes from his rapidly dwindling funds. And so, on the morning of December 12th, Phileas Fogg, Ayuda and Passepartout boarded the Henrietta, a small trading vessel, and set sail for England. Racing against time, racing against fate, racing toward a finish line that seemed, with each passing hour, more and more impossible to reach. The Henrietta was not built for passenger comfort. She was a trading vessel, her holds filled with cargo, her cabins small and spare. But Captain Andrew Speedy, as he was called, proved to be a skilled sailor, and the ship cut through the Atlantic waters with determined speed. For the first few days, the weather favored them. The wind was steady from the west, filling the sails, and the Henrietta made excellent progress. Fogg calculated their speed and estimated that they might reach Liverpool in 9 days, perhaps 10. It would be tight, desperately tight, but it might be enough. Ayuda and Passepartout settled into the cramped quarters below deck. There was little to do but wait, to watch the ocean slide past, to hope. Ayuda spent her time in quiet reflection, sometimes reading, sometimes simply staring out at the endless water. She found herself thinking not about the wager, not about India, but about the future. A future that, for the first time, felt uncertain but also full of possibility. Fogg maintained his routine as best he could in the limited space. He walked the deck at regular intervals. He took his meals with the captain, the two of them dining in near silence. And he calculated, over and over, the distance remaining, the speed required, the hours left before the deadline. But on the 4th day out, the wind shifted and died. The sails went slack. The ship slowed to a crawl, drifting rather than sailing. Captain Speedy frowned at the sky, at the still air, and shook his head. "Calm," he said. "Could last hours, could last days." Fogg's jaw tightened. "Can we not use the engines?" "What engines?" Speedy said. "This is a sailing vessel, Mr. Fogg. No steam, just wind and canvas." Fogg stared at the motionless sails, and for a moment despair threatened to overwhelm him. They had come so far, endured so much, and now, here in the middle of the Atlantic, they were becalmed, drifting helplessly while time slipped away. But then an idea formed, desperate and audacious. "Captain," Fogg said, "what if we burn the ship's cargo as fuel, convert the ship to steam power temporarily, Speedy stared at him as though he had gone mad. Burn the cargo? That's valuable wood, Mr. Fogg. That's why I'm carrying it. I will pay you for it. Whatever it's worth, I will pay. And what do we burn it in? We've got no boilers, no steam engine. But you have a stove for heating, and you have iron plating in the hold. We could fashion a crude boiler, heat water, generate steam. It would be inefficient, dangerous even, but it might work. Speedy considered this madness. The man wanted to tear apart a sailing ship and turn it into a makeshift steamboat. It was insane. It was also possibly brilliant. You'd pay for the cargo, every plank, and if we blow ourselves up trying this fool scheme, then we will at least have tried. Speedy grinned suddenly, a wild, reckless grin. You're a lunatic, Mr. Fogg, but I like it. Let's do it. And so, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, the crew of the Henrietta began tearing apart their own ship. They hauled the cargo of lumber up from the hold, planks and beams, all destined for sale in Bordeaux, but now repurposed as fuel. They rigged a crude boiler using the ship's stove and any metal they could find. They attached it to a paddle wheel mechanism that Speedy's engineer improvised from spare parts. It was a contraption that would make any proper shipwright weep. But it worked. They fed the lumber into the makeshift furnace, the flames roaring, the heat intense. Steam built up in the boiler, hissing and spitting. And slowly, incredibly, the paddle wheel began to turn. The Henrietta lurched forward, no longer a sailing ship, but something new, something monstrous and magnificent. A hybrid of wind and fire, desperation and ingenuity. They burned through the cargo with frightening speed. Plank after plank fed into the flames, the ship's own substance consumed to drive it forward. Captain Speedy watched his cargo disappear with a mixture of horror and exhilaration. At this rate, he said to Fogg, we'll burn through the cargo in 3 days. After that, we start burning the ship itself. Then we will burn the ship, Fogg said calmly, and they did. On the 7th day, when the last of the cargo was gone, they began feeding the ship's own wooden fittings into the furnace. The spare spars, the masts, the deck planks, anything that would burn. The Henrietta, noble vessel that she was, sacrificed herself piece by piece to carry them forward. Aeuda watched this destruction with a kind of awe. Here was Fogg's desperation made visible. He was burning a ship, spending a fortune, destroying property, all to reach London in time. Was it madness? Was it nobility? Perhaps it was both. Passepartout worked alongside the crew, hauling wood, feeding the furnace, his hands blistered, his face blackened with soot. He had caused delays with his foolishness, and now he would work until he dropped to help make amends. On the 9th day, land appeared on the horizon. The coast of Ireland, green and misty. They had crossed the Atlantic. The Henrietta, barely recognizable now, her deck stripped, her masts gone, her hull riding low in the water, limped into Queenstown Harbour on the southern Irish coast. Captain Speedy surveyed the wreckage of his ship with a rueful smile. Well, Mr. Fogg, you've successfully turned my fine vessel into kindling. I hope it was worth it. Fogg paid him the remainder of the agreed sum, plus a significant bonus. It was, Captain. Thank you. They disembarked and immediately sought out the next means of transport. A steamship was leaving for Liverpool within the hour. Fogg booked passage, and they sailed up the Irish Sea toward England. They reached Liverpool on the evening of December 20th. The deadline was December 21st at 8:45 in the evening. They had less than 24 hours to reach London. But as Fogg stepped onto the Liverpool docks, a hand fell on his shoulder. Mr. Phileas Fogg, you are under arrest. It was Detective Fix, his face grim but triumphant. Fogg turned, his expression weary but unsurprised. On what charge, Mr. Fix? For the robbery of the Bank of England. The warrant has finally arrived. You will come with me to the police station. Aeuda gasped. Passepartout shouted in protest, but Fix was unmoved. He had his warrant, he had his authority, and after months of pursuit, he finally had his man. Fogg was taken to the Liverpool police station, where he was placed in a cell. No amount of explanation would sway Fix. No protest of innocence would change his mind. The detective had traveled around the world for this moment, and he would not be denied. Hours passed, precious, irreplaceable hours. Fogg sat in the cell, his watch on the bench beside him, watching the minutes tick away. By morning, by noon, by afternoon, the deadline drew closer and closer. Aeuda and Passepartout waited at the station, desperate, helpless. They pleaded with Fix, with the police inspector, with anyone who would listen. But there was nothing to be done. A warrant was a warrant. The law was the law. And then, at 8:30 in the evening on December 20th, just over 24 hours before the deadline, a telegram arrived. The real bank robber had been caught in Edinburgh 3 days ago. Fogg was innocent. Detective Fix, reading the telegram, went pale. His hands trembled. He had been wrong. After all this time, all this effort, all this certainty, he had been wrong. He walked to the cell where Fogg sat, calm and composed, and unlocked the door. "Mr. Fogg," Fix said, his voice hoarse, "you are free to go. The real criminal has been apprehended. I apologize. I was mistaken." Fogg rose, collected his watch, and walked out of the cell without a word. There was no time for recriminations, no time for anger, only time to run. He checked his watch. It was now 9 o'clock in the evening. The deadline was tomorrow at 8:45 in the evening, approximately 24 hours away. London was a 4-hour train journey from Liverpool, but even if they caught the night train immediately, even if there were no delays, they would arrive in London by 1 in the morning. That would leave nearly 20 hours to cross London and reach the Reform Club. It was possible, just barely possible. But when they reached the railway station, gasping and desperate, they learned that the night express had already departed. The next train to London would not leave until morning. Fogg stood on the platform, his face frozen, his mind calculating. They would arrive in London by noon tomorrow. That would leave less than 9 hours to reach the Reform Club. Still possible, but the margin had become a razor's edge. They boarded the morning train in silence, exhaustion etched into every line of their faces. Aeuda sat beside Fogg, her hand resting gently on his. She wanted to offer comfort, to say something hopeful, but words felt inadequate. The train carried them south through the English countryside, fields and villages, hills and hedgerows, all achingly familiar after months of foreign lands. England. Home, but would they reach the Reform Club in time? Fogg stared out the window, his expression unreadable, and for the first time in the entire journey, he allowed himself to wonder if it had all been for nothing. The train from Liverpool rolled through the English countryside, the landscape softened by winter mist. Fields lay fallow under grey skies. Villages passed, their chimneys trailing smoke. This was England in December, cold, quiet, wrapped in the melancholy beauty of the dying year. Fogg sat by the window, his face expressionless, but his mind was a storm of calculations. They would arrive in London by noon. The Reform Club was in Pall Mall, an easy journey from the station under normal circumstances. But these were not normal circumstances. There would be traffic, delays, the unpredictable chaos of London streets. And they had only until 8:45 in the evening. 8 hours and 45 minutes to cross a city and reach a club. It should have been simple. It should have been assured. But after everything that had gone wrong, after every delay and disaster, Fogg could not bring himself to feel confident. Hope had become a fragile thing, worn thin by months of struggle. Aeuda sat beside him, her hand still resting on his. She had been quiet since Liverpool, sensing that words would not help, that all either of them could do now was wait and endure. Passepartout sat across from them, his face drawn with exhaustion and guilt. He blamed himself for so many of the delays, the temple in Benares, the drugging in Hong Kong, the capture in Nebraska. He had been nothing but a burden, he thought, a liability that had cost his master the wager. But Fogg, when Passepartout had tried to apologize again that morning, had simply shaken his head. "You have been loyal. That is worth more than any wager." The train arrived at Charing Cross Station at noon. They disembarked into the familiar chaos of London, the crowds, the vendors, the smell of coal smoke and roasting chestnuts, the sound of carriage wheels on cobblestones and newsboys shouting headlines. Fogg led the way to the street and hailed a cab. "Number 7, Savile Row," he told the driver. "Quickly." The cab rattled through the streets, weaving between omnibuses and delivery wagons, past shops decked with Christmas greenery and windows displaying toys and sweets. London was preparing for the holiday, oblivious to the quiet drama of 3 travelers racing against a deadline. They reached Savile Row, and Fogg instructed the driver to wait. He would go inside, freshen up, change into proper attire. He had been wearing the same clothes for days, and one did not enter the Reform Club looking like a vagabond. Ayuda and Passepartout followed him into the house. It was strange to be back, after all this time, in this quiet, orderly place where the journey had begun. The house felt smaller somehow, as though the world had expanded, and this single dwelling could no longer contain the enormity of what they had experienced. Fogg went upstairs, washed, shaved, and dressed in a fresh suit. He consulted his watch. It was now 2 o'clock. 6 hours and 45 minutes remained, plenty of time, and yet. He descended the stairs to find Ayuda and Passepartout waiting in the sitting room. Ayuda looked pale, fragile, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. Passepartout looked ready to collapse. "You should both rest," Fogg said. "There is nothing more to be done until this evening." "Will you rest, monsieur?" Passepartout asked. Fogg hesitated. "I will try." But he knew he would not sleep. His mind was too full, too restless. Instead, he sat in his favorite chair, the one where he had sat 80 days ago when this impossible journey had begun, and he allowed himself to think, not about the wager, not about the money, but about what he had gained. He had seen the world. He had crossed continents and oceans. He had faced dangers and made choices that surprised even himself, and he had found Ayuda. She was in the next room, resting on the sofa, her breathing soft and even. She had come into his life as a stranger in need, and now she was something more, something he did not have words for but felt with a certainty that was almost painful. If he lost the wager, he would lose his fortune. But he would not lose her, not if she would have him. The thought settled something in his chest, some anxiety he had not fully acknowledged. The wager mattered, yes, but it was not everything. The afternoon passed slowly. The clock ticked. Outside, the winter light faded, the sky deepening from grey to charcoal. Lamplighters made their rounds, touching flame to gas lamps, the streets glowing softly in the dusk. At 7 o'clock, Fogg rose and checked his watch. 1 hour and 45 minutes. He found Ayuda awake, sitting by the fire, her face thoughtful. "It's almost time," he said. She nodded. "Whatever happens, I want you to know I am grateful for everything, for my life, for this journey, for knowing you." Fogg looked at her, and for once his carefully controlled expression softened. "Ayuda, there is something I must say to you, but not now, not until this is finished." "Will you wait?" "Of course," she said, her heart aching with hope. Passepartout appeared, dressed in his best, ready to accompany Fogg to the Reform Club. At 8:15, Fogg put on his coat and hat, stepped out into the London evening and walked toward Pall Mall. The streets were busy with evening traffic, but Fogg moved through them with the same measured pace he had maintained around the world. He did not hurry. He did not run. He simply walked, as though he had all the time in the world. They reached the Reform Club at 8:30. Fogg paused outside the familiar entrance, the gas lamps casting warm light on the stone facade. Inside, his fellow club members would be gathered, the same gentleman who had made the wager with him 80 days ago, who had scoffed at the possibility, who had bet £40,000 that he would fail. Fogg checked his watch. 8:32, 13 minutes until the deadline, plenty of time. He climbed the steps, opened the door and walked into the club. The reading room was warm, filled with the smell of leather and tobacco. Several gentlemen sat in their usual chairs, reading newspapers, playing cards. They glanced up as Fogg entered, and their faces registered shock. "Fogg," one of them exclaimed. "Good God, man, we thought you'd failed. We heard nothing, no telegrams, no word." "I have returned," Fogg said calmly. He consulted his watch. "I believe I am on time." The gentlemen scrambled to check their own watches to compare the time. The great clock on the wall read 8:44, 1 minute to spare. Fogg had won. The room erupted in astonishment, in disbelief, in grudging admiration. Hands were shaken, backs were clapped, someone called for champagne. But Fogg, standing in the midst of this celebration, felt strangely hollow. He had won the wager, yes. He had proven the impossible, but at what cost? He had spent nearly the entire fortune he had wagered, on steamships and elephants, on bribes and rescues, on burning a ship for fuel. The £20,000 he would win back would barely cover his expenses. Financially, he had gained almost nothing, and yet he thought of the journey, of Ayuda's smile, of Passepartout's loyalty, of sunrises over the Pacific and temples in Japan, and the vast, wild beauty of the American plains. He had gained something money could not buy. He excused himself from the celebration, collected Passepartout, and walked back into the cold December night. When he reached Savile Row, he found Ayuda waiting by the fire, her hands folded in her lap, her expression anxious. "Well," she asked. "I won," Fogg said, "by 1 minute. I have won the wager." Ayuda's face lit with joy, and she rose to embrace him. But then she saw his expression, distant, troubled, and she pulled back, concerned. "What is it? What's wrong?" Fogg sank into his chair, suddenly exhausted. "I have won the wager, but I have spent almost everything in doing so. I have perhaps £1,000 or £2,000 remaining. My fortune is gone." Ayuda stared at him. "But the wager was for £20,000. Surely the wager will return my original 20,000, which I spent on the journey. I will gain almost nothing. I am effectively ruined." There was a long silence. And then Ayuda knelt beside his chair, took his hands in hers and said, "You are not ruined. You are the richest man I know. You saved my life. You crossed the world. You sacrificed everything for loyalty and compassion. If that is ruin, then it is the finest kind." Fogg looked at her, and something in his chest, something that had been locked away for years, broke open. "Ayuda," he said, his voice rough, "I have nothing left to offer you. No fortune, no guarantees, but if you would consider, if you would consent to marry me, I would count myself the wealthiest man alive." Ayuda's eyes filled with tears. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." And there, in the quiet sitting room at number 7, Savile Row, as the fire burned low and the clock ticked past 9, Phileas Fogg, who had travelled around the world, found that the greatest journey had been the one to his own heart. Passepartout, standing in the doorway, witnessed this moment and quietly withdrew, a smile on his face. His master had won more than a wager. He had won a life. The next morning dawned cold and bright over London. Frost silvered the window panes, and the sky was a pale, washed blue. Inside number 7, Savile Row, Phileas Fogg woke early, as was his custom, and for the first time in 80 days, he did not immediately reach for his watch to calculate distances and schedules. The journey was over, the wager was won, and Ayuda had said yes. He dressed quietly and went downstairs to find Passepartout already in the kitchen, preparing breakfast with unusual enthusiasm. The Frenchman was humming, actually humming, something Fogg had never heard him do before. "Good morning, monsieur," Passepartout said brightly. "I trust you slept well." "Well enough," Fogg said. "And you seem in good spirits." "How could I not be, monsieur? We have circled the globe, we have won the wager, and you are to be married. It is a day for celebration." Fogg allowed himself a small smile. "Indeed it is." They breakfasted together. Fogg, Passepartout and Ayuda, who appeared wearing a borrowed dress, her hair arranged simply, her face radiant. She looked at Fogg with such warmth that even Passepartout, not an unobservant man, felt his heart swell. After breakfast, Fogg set about making arrangements. The wedding would be simple, he decided, conducted at a local church as soon as the banns could be posted. There was no need for elaborate ceremony. What mattered was the commitment, the promise. He also needed to settle his affairs at the Reform Club, to collect the money he had won, to determine exactly how much remained of his fortune after the expenses of the journey. "I will go to the club this afternoon," Fogg said, "and I will make the final accounting." Ayuda nodded, though she seemed troubled. "You said last night that you fear you have spent almost everything. Are you certain? Perhaps there has been some miscalculation." "I am quite certain," Fogg said gently, "but it does not matter. I would spend it all again for the same outcome." That afternoon, Fogg walked to the Reform Club, the winter sun slanting through the bare trees of St. James's Park. He entered the club to find several of the gentlemen who had made the wager with him gathered in the reading room, waiting. They greeted him warmly, still marveling at his success. One of them handed him a bank draft for £20,000, the money he had staked and now reclaimed. "Congratulations, Fogg," the gentleman said. "You've done what we all thought impossible, circled the world in 80 days. Extraordinary. Thank you," Fogg said, folding the draft and placing it in his pocket. But as he walked home, he did the mental arithmetic once more. The journey had cost him nearly £18,000. The wager returned 20,000. That left him with approximately £2,000 remaining of his original fortune, enough to live modestly, but not in the manner to which he had been accustomed. He was, effectively, a man of modest means now, no longer wealthy, no longer secure. And yet, as he walked through the cold December streets, he found that the thought did not trouble him as much as it should have. He had Ayuda. He had his health. He had experienced wonders beyond imagining. Money, he was beginning to understand, was the least important thing he had gained. When he arrived back at Savile Row, he found Passepartout in a state of agitation, pacing the sitting room. Monsieur, I have made a terrible discovery." Fogg frowned. "What is it?" "The calendar, monsieur. I was just speaking with the vicar about arranging the wedding, and he mentioned the date. Today is Sunday, December 22nd. But according to my journal, today should be Monday, December 23rd. Fogg stared at him, uncomprehending. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we've lost track of a day somewhere. Either that or," Passepartout paused, his eyes widening, "or we gained a day. Monsieur, do you remember crossing the international date line?" Fogg went very still. The international date line. They had crossed it on the Columbia, sailing from Japan to America. When you cross from west to east, you gain a day. The ship's captain had announced it, had made note of it in the log. But Fogg, in all his meticulous calculations, had not accounted for it. He had gained a day, which meant, "What day did we arrive at the Reform Club last night?" Fogg asked, his voice unnaturally calm. "December 21st, monsieur. Saturday, December 21st. And the deadline was Saturday, December 21st at 8:45 in the evening." "Yes, monsieur." Fogg sat down slowly, his mind racing. "We arrived with 1 minute to spare. But if we gained a day crossing the date line," Passepartout's face lit up with sudden understanding, "then we actually had 25 hours to spare. We could have taken our time. We were never in danger of losing." Fogg stared at the wall, processing this revelation. He had thought the margin was razor-thin. He had thought they had won by the smallest possible fraction. But in reality, they had won with a full day to spare. All the panic, the desperation, the frantic rush from Liverpool, it had been unnecessary. They could have rested. They could have taken a leisurely train. They could have stopped for tea. For a long moment, Fogg said nothing. And then, incredibly, he began to laugh. It was a quiet laugh, almost rusty from disuse, but it was genuine. Passepartout stared at him in astonishment. He had never heard his master laugh before. "Monsieur, we won," Fogg said, still laughing softly. "We won by an entire day, and I never realized. I thought we had won by 1 minute. I thought it was the narrowest escape imaginable. But all along we had time." Ayuda, hearing the commotion, came into the room. "What's happened?" Fogg rose and took her hands. "We gained a day, crossing the international date line. I miscalculated. We were never in as much danger as I believed." "Does it matter?" Ayuda asked. "You won regardless." "It matters only in this," Fogg said, his expression softening. "It means that even my careful calculations, even my precision, could not account for everything. The world is stranger and more generous than I gave it credit for." He looked at her and at Passepartout and felt something shift inside him, some long-held rigidity loosening, some door opening. "I spent my life trying to control time, to master it," he said quietly. "I thought that precision and schedules were all that mattered. But this journey has taught me that the best things, the most important things, cannot be planned or predicted. They simply happen if you are open to them." Ayuda smiled. "Like rescuing a stranger from a pyre." "Like rescuing a stranger from a pyre," Fogg agreed. "Like trusting a servant who makes mistakes. Like burning a ship to cross an ocean. Like falling in love." He said the last words looking directly at her, and Ayuda's eyes filled with tears. "I was so afraid," she whispered. "When I thought you had lost your fortune, I was afraid you would regret saving me, regret bringing me along." "Never," Fogg said. "You are the best part of this entire journey. You are the reason it mattered." They stood there, hands clasped, and Passepartout quietly slipped out of the room, giving them privacy. That evening, as the three of them sat by the fire, Fogg made an announcement. "I have decided," he said, "that we will use the remaining funds to establish a small household here in London. It will not be lavish, but it will be comfortable. And Ayuda, if you are still willing, we will marry as soon as the arrangements can be made." "I am willing," Ayuda said. "I have never been more certain of anything." Passepartout cleared his throat. "Monsieur, if I may, what will become of me? I understand if you no longer need a servant, given the reduced circumstances." Fogg looked at him, surprised. "Passepartout, you are not simply a servant. You are a friend, and you will remain with us if you wish." There is always room for loyalty. Passepartout's eyes glistened. I wish it very much, monsieur. Thank you. They sat in companionable silence, the fire crackling, the winter night pressing close outside. London went about its business, oblivious to the quiet miracle unfolding in this unremarkable house on Savile Row. Three people who had been strangers, thrown together by chance and wager, had become a family. The world, vast and turning, had brought them full circle. But the journey was not over. In truth, it was just beginning. Fogg looked at Ayuda, her face lit by firelight, and thought of the long road ahead. A life built not on schedules and precision, but on love and possibility, on the understanding that the best adventures cannot be planned, only lived. Outside, the city bells rang the hour, 8 o'clock. Time for dinner, time for rest, time for the quiet rituals of an ordinary evening. But nothing, Phileas Fogg thought, would ever be ordinary again. And that, he realized with something approaching wonder, was exactly as it should be. The days that followed were filled with quiet preparations. Fogg, Ayuda and Passepartout settled into a new rhythm, one shaped not by schedules and railways, but by the gentler demands of ordinary life, shopping for groceries, arranging furniture, planning a simple wedding. London in late December was cold but beautiful. The city dressed for Christmas with evergreen garlands and ribbons, shop windows filled with toys and sweets, the smell of roasted chestnuts and pine branches perfuming the air. Children sang carols on street corners, churches rang their bells. The world felt hopeful, renewed. Ayuda walked through the city with wonder, seeing it properly for the first time. Before, she had only glimpsed London in the rushed hours before departure. Now she could take her time, could admire the grand buildings and quiet parks, could begin to imagine this city as home. Fogg accompanied her on these walks, pointing out landmarks with an uncharacteristic warmth. He showed her the British Museum, where they wandered through halls of ancient treasures. He took her to Hyde Park, where bare trees stood stark against the winter sky. He bought her chestnuts from a street vendor, and they ate them standing on a bridge over the Serpentine, watching swans glide through the cold water. "I never knew you could be like this," Ayuda said one afternoon as they walked through a quiet square. "Like what?" "Present, at ease. When we first met, you seemed so distant, so focused on the journey that you barely saw the world around you. But now I see it," Fogg said quietly, "because you taught me to." Ayuda smiled, linking her arm through his. "I think you were always capable of seeing. You simply needed a reason." The wedding was arranged for December 27th, a small ceremony to be held at a local church. Ayuda had no family to invite, and Fogg had no close friends beyond his club acquaintances, so the guest list was modest. A few gentlemen from the Reform Club, the vicar and Passepartout, who would serve as witness and best man. Ayuda borrowed a dress from a kind neighbor, a simple gown of ivory silk. She wore her hair loose, adorned with a few white winter roses that Passepartout had somehow procured. She looked beautiful, radiant, her face glowing with happiness. Fogg wore his best suit, his bearing as upright and composed as ever, but when he saw Ayuda walking toward him down the church aisle, something in his expression cracked, a flicker of emotion, raw and unguarded, that made Passepartout's eyes water. The ceremony was brief and lovely. The vicar spoke of love and commitment, of journeys taken together, of vows kept through trials. Fogg and Ayuda repeated their promises in steady voices, hands clasped, eyes locked. And when the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, Fogg kissed Ayuda gently, a kiss that held all the things he could not say, gratitude and wonder, and a love so deep it frightened him. The small congregation applauded. Passepartout wiped his eyes unabashedly, and Phileas Fogg, who had spent his life avoiding emotion, found himself smiling, truly smiling, for the first time in years. They walked out of the church into the cold December afternoon, Ayuda's hand in Fogg's, and the world seemed bright despite the grey sky. Bells rang from nearby churches, celebrating the season, celebrating them. A modest wedding breakfast was held at Savile Row, just the handful of guests, Passepartout presiding over the kitchen with surprising skill. There was roasted chicken and potatoes, bread and cheese, a small cake that Passepartout had baked himself, slightly lopsided but delicious. One of the gentlemen from the Reform Club raised a glass. "To Mr. and Mrs. Fogg, may your life together be filled with as much adventure as your courtship." Everyone laughed and drank. Fogg, holding Ayuda's hand beneath the table, felt a contentment so complete it was almost painful. After the guests departed, the three of them, Fogg, Ayuda and Passepartout, sat by the fire, exhausted but happy. "What will you do now, monsieur?" Passepartout asked. "Now that the journey is over and you are married." Fogg considered this. For so long, his life had been defined by routine, by schedules, by the wager. Now that purpose was gone, replaced by something both simpler and more complex, a life shared with another person. "I suppose," he said slowly, "I will learn to live differently, to find purpose not in precision but in simply being." "That sounds wise, monsieur," Passepartout said, "though I confess I will miss the excitement, the elephants and storms and narrow escapes." Ayuda laughed. "I think I have had enough excitement to last a lifetime. I would be quite content with a quiet life from now on." "Quiet, perhaps," Fogg said, glancing at her with a hint of mischief that surprised even himself. "But not uneventful. The world is very large, Ayuda. There are still many places we have not seen." She looked at him, hope and excitement mingling in her expression. "Are you saying we might travel again? Not around the world in 80 days, Fogg said. "But perhaps when we are ready, we might take a different journey, a slower one where we stop to admire the views." "I would like that very much," Ayuda said softly. Outside, the London evening deepened into night. Lamps glowed in windows. Families gathered for dinner. The city hummed with the life of millions. And in the quiet sitting room at number 7, Savile Row, 3 people who had found each other against all odds sat together, watching the fire burn low, content in the knowledge that they were exactly where they were meant to be. The journey around the world was over, but the journey of life, of love and friendship, of discovering what truly mattered, was only beginning. Fogg looked at Ayuda, her face peaceful in the firelight, and thought of all the miles they had traveled, all the dangers they had faced. He thought of the young widow on a funeral pyre, the terrified woman on an elephant, the brave companion crossing the Pacific. And he thought of how she had changed him, had opened his eyes to a world he had been too focused to see. "Ayuda," he said quietly. She looked at him. "Yes, I never thanked you. For what? For choosing to stay, for saying yes, for making my life infinitely richer than any wager ever could." Ayuda's eyes glistened. "And I never thanked you for saving my life, not just from the flames, but from loneliness and despair. You gave me hope when I had none. You gave me a future I thought I had lost." They sat in silence, hands entwined, and Passepartout, sensing this was a moment for 2 rather than 3, quietly excused himself and went upstairs. Alone now, Fogg and Ayuda sat close together, watching the embers glow. "Do you ever regret it?" Ayuda asked softly. "The fortune you spent, the life you had before?" "Never," Fogg said. "Not for a single moment. I was alive before, yes, but I was not living. There is a difference. And now I am living," he said simply. "With you." Ayuda leaned her head against his shoulder, and Fogg wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. Outside, the city bells began to ring the hour, 10 o'clock, the sound clear and beautiful in the cold night air. Time, Fogg thought. He had spent so much of his life measuring it, counting it, racing against it. But now he understood that time was not an enemy to be conquered or a resource to be hoarded. Time was simply the medium in which love unfolded, in which lives were lived, in which moments like this, quiet, perfect moments, could exist. He kissed the top of Ayuda's head, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling her warmth against him. "Phileas," she murmured. "Yes, I'm very glad you made that wager." Fogg smiled. "So am I," and there, in the dying firelight, on a winter's night in London, 2 people who had traveled the world found that the greatest journey had brought them not around the globe, but into each other's hearts. The wager was won. The fortune was spent. The adventure was over, but the love story that had only just begun. And so our story comes to rest, like a ship pulling into harbor after a long voyage, its sails furled, its journey complete. Phileas Fogg, the man who measured his life in minutes, who lived by schedules and precision, who thought himself immune to the messiness of human emotion. That man traveled around the world and discovered that the greatest distances are not measured in miles, but in the space between a closed heart and an open one. He set out to prove a point, to win a wager, to demonstrate that the modern world had become small and conquerable. And what did he find instead? That the world is vast beyond imagining, that it is full of strangers who become friends, of dangers that test your courage, of moments of grace that arrive unplanned and undeserved. He found that saving a life matters more than keeping a schedule. That loyalty is worth more than gold. That love is the one journey no map can chart. Ayuda, who climbed a funeral pyre expecting death, found instead a new life, not because she was rescued, but because she chose to continue to hope, to trust in the kindness of near strangers and the possibility of beginning again. She crossed oceans not as a passenger, but as a participant, not as a victim, but as someone discovering her own strength. And Passepartout, dear loyal Passepartout, who wanted nothing more than a quiet life, found himself riding elephants through jungles, fighting off raiders, crossing continents on sledges and burning ships. He learned that adventure is not something you go looking for. It is something that finds you if you are brave enough to say yes. Together, these three improbable companions circled the globe. Together they faced storms and delays, heat and cold, pursuit and danger. And together they discovered what cannot be found in any guidebook or timetable, that the bonds forged in adversity are the strongest, that compassion costs nothing but gives everything, that the world is at once larger and smaller than we can imagine. Think of the miles they traveled, from London's fog to the heat of Suez, from India's jungles to Japan's serene temples, across the vast Pacific, across the wild American frontier, across the stormy Atlantic, every country a revelation, every delay a test, every moment a choice between holding tight to the plan or opening yourself to the unexpected. And think of what they learned along the way. That precision has its place, but so does improvisation. That wealth can be spent and regained, but time with people you love is irreplaceable. That sometimes the greatest act of courage is not to press forward, but to stop and help a stranger in need. Phileas Fogg won his wager. He returned to the Reform Club with minutes to spare, or so he thought. The truth, discovered later, was even stranger. He had won by a full day, having gained time crossing the international date line, a quirk of geography and human convention that his careful calculations had not accounted for. It is a fitting irony. The man who lived by clocks and schedules, who prided himself on precision, succeeded partly through his own determination and partly through grace. The gift of a day he did not know he had, the mercy of time itself bending in his favor. But the wager in the end was the least of what he won. He won Ayuda's love, freely given, earned through kindness and courage. He won Passepartout's unwavering loyalty, tested by trial and proven unbreakable. He won a new understanding of what it means to be alive, not merely to exist in routine and order, but to feel deeply, to risk greatly, to love without reservation. The fortune he spent, and he spent nearly all of it, went to steamship captains and railway companies, to elephant traders and sledge drivers, to bribes and rescues, and a ship burned for fuel. Financially, he gained almost nothing. But in every way that matters, he became the richest man in the world. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let Fogg and Ayuda's story rest in your dreams. Let it remind you that the world is full of wonder, waiting to be discovered. That kindness is never wasted, that the best things in life, love, friendship, beauty, meaning, cannot be purchased or planned, only recognized and cherished when they arrive. Let their journey remind you that it is never too late to change, to open your heart, to take a risk on something that seems impossible. Fogg was a man of middle age, set in his ways, convinced that emotion was weakness and routine was safety. But he learned, he grew, he became someone new. And so can we all. Think of Ayuda, who lost everything and found a life more beautiful than the one taken from her. Think of Passepartout, who stumbled and erred but never stopped trying, never stopped caring. Think of Fogg, who learned that the heart, like the world, is far larger than any schedule can contain. Sleep now, knowing that somewhere in the world, someone is embarking on their own journey, taking their own risks, opening their own heart to the possibility of wonder. Sleep knowing that adventure is not reserved for the young or the wealthy or the fearless, but is available to anyone brave enough to say yes when opportunity knocks. Let the rhythm of train wheels lull you, that steady, soothing beat that carried our travelers across continents. Let the rocking of ships cradle you, the gentle sway of oceans crossed under starlit skies. Let the warmth of Fogg and Ayuda's fireside rest settle over you like a blanket, soft and safe. Tomorrow is another day. Tomorrow, perhaps, you will begin your own journey, whether it carries you around the world or simply helps you see your own familiar street with new eyes. But tonight, rest in the knowledge that the world is vast and kind, that love is real and worth every risk, that time spent in pursuit of what matters is never wasted. Around the world in 80 days, around the heart in a single moment. Both journeys are extraordinary, both are worth taking. Good night, sweet dreams, and may you wake tomorrow ready to see the world and yourself with the wonder of someone who has just discovered that impossible things are possible after all.